Britain did not become a global empire because it was larger, richer, or biologically different from other peoples. Its rise began with limits. An island on the edge of Europe, short of land, vulnerable to hunger, pushed toward ships because the sea was both barrier and road. The cold fact is that empire often grows from weakness before it looks like power. But when a small island learned to turn distance into control, what was truly being lost? And what is the real story of how Britain became a global empire? Britain began as a place of limits, long before it became a name spoken across oceans. On the map, it sits close enough to Europe to be shaped by every movement from the continent, yet far enough away to make water a permanent fact of life. Its fields could feed people, but not without effort. Its weather was damp, changeable, and often unforgiving. Its rivers helped movement inland, but its coasts kept reminding every generation that the edge of the known world was never very far away. It was not a vast plain or a great river valley. It was an island world broken by hills, estuaries, marshes, and regional differences, a place where survival often depended on adapting to small landscapes, rather than commanding one enormous one. The deeper beginning of this story is not imperial at all. It reaches back to the older human condition, when communities everywhere had to read weather, food, water, danger, and distance with care. No human group began with empire in its hands. People began with bodies that tired, stomachs that needed food, children who needed protection, and memories tied to the ground beneath them. In Britain, that ancient human dependence on place remained visible for a long time. The sea gave fish and roots, but it also brought storms, raiders, traders, migrants, and uncertainty. The island could never be sealed completely, and it could never be opened without risk. That tension slowly trained a habit of mind, looking outward while still feeling vulnerable at home. Geography did not force Britain to become an empire, because geography never writes history by itself. But geography shaped the questions Britain had to answer again and again. How does an island defend itself? How does a small kingdom gain wealth when land is limited? How does a people use water not only as protection but as passage? These questions were not answered in one dramatic moment. They settled gradually into habits, tools, institutions, and choices. The climate mattered because it made agriculture dependable in some places and difficult in others. The soil mattered because wealth first came from what land could produce. The coastline mattered because almost every direction eventually led to water. The position mattered because Britain faced both the Atlantic and the European world, standing between the old roots of the continent and the wider ocean that later connected the Americas, Africa, and Asia. This position would become powerful only when ships, money, navigation, and political organization made distance useful. Before that, it was simply exposure. The first human beings who reached these islands during earlier periods of prehistory did not see a future empire. They saw changing coastlines, cold periods, warmer intervals, animals, shelters, and the difficult work of staying alive. Later communities farmed, traded, built, fought, and buried their dead in landscapes that were never isolated from the rest of Europe. This matters because the rise of Britain cannot be understood as the sudden awakening of a chosen nation. It grew from layers of ordinary human adaptation, from people learning where to plant, where to sail, where to defend, and where to trade. Even the island itself was not always experienced in the same way. At times, the sea narrowed contact. At other times, it widened it. A channel could be a wall in one generation and a road in another. That simple reversal would become one of the quiet foundations of later power. The real story begins, then, with a small island learning the meaning of its own edges. Its limits were not only weaknesses, and its advantages were not yet destiny. Britain's future empire would depend on turning constraint into movement, scarcity into trade, danger into naval attention, and distance into a kind of reach. But at the beginning, before flags, colonies, and global maps, there was only a damp island at the edge of Europe, surrounded by water, dependent on land, and already shaped by the old human need to survive within the boundaries of place. For Britain, the sea was never one thing. It could protect a village from armies, then carry enemies to the same shore. It could separate an island from Europe, then make that island part of a much wider world. This double meaning is one of the quiet keys to understanding how Britain later became a global empire. A wall made of water is different from a wall made of stone. It moves. It changes with weather, tide, season, skill, and courage. To people without strong ships, the sea can feel like the end of movement. To people who learn ships, maps, winds, ports, and discipline, the same sea becomes a road that no one has paved. Britain's early position was shaped by that slow transformation. The island did not begin with control over the ocean. It began with exposure to it. Its coasts were long, irregular, and difficult to watch completely. Small boats could cross narrow waters. Traders could arrive. Raiders could appear. Migrants could settle. Ideas could move with objects, languages, tools, and beliefs. This is close to the oldest human pattern. From the beginning, human beings survived not by being the strongest animals, but by learning routes through difficult environments. A river, a coast, a valley, or a ridge could change the future of a group because it changed what bodies could reach, what food could be carried, and what dangers could be avoided. In Britain, water became one of those routes, but only after generations learned how to live with its risk. The English Channel did not simply cut Britain off. It measured the cost of contact. Crossing it required knowledge, timing, and purpose. The North Sea connected Britain to Scandinavia, the Low Countries, and northern trade. The Irish Sea connected Western Britain with Ireland and Atlantic routes. Around the island, water created both separation and invitation. This made Britain different from a kingdom deep inside a continent, where roads and borders were more often controlled by land armies. An island kingdom had to think about ships not as decoration, but as part of survival. Fishing, coastal trade, ferrying, naval defence, and port life slowly built practical familiarity with water. None of this means empire was inevitable. Many coastal peoples became skilled sailors without building global empires. What matters is that Britain's geography made the sea impossible to ignore. Every political crisis, every invasion fear, every trade opportunity, and every hunger for new wealth had to pass through the question of water. Over time, that question reached beyond survival. It became economic. Wool, grain, fish, timber, metal, and later manufactured goods needed routes. A ship could carry more than a cart over a long distance if the ship survived the voyage. Ports gathered people who understood prices, languages, risk, credit, and news. The sea trained a different kind of attention to distance. A farmer might measure life by fields and seasons. A sailor or merchant measured life by winds, cargo, storms, and foreign markets. Here again, the story touches the older beginning of humanity. Human expansion across the planet was never only a story of walking forward. It was also a story of noticing paths where other animals saw only barriers. Coastlines fed people and guided movement. Water forced caution, but it also rewarded memory, cooperation, and tools. Britain inherited that ancient human ability to turn a boundary into a path. In later centuries, when stronger states, better ships, and larger markets appeared, the island's old relationship with the sea changed in scale. What had once been local movement between coasts could become Atlantic trade. What had once been defense against invasion could become naval strategy. What had once been an edge could become an opening. The island did not escape its limits. It learned to move through them, slowly building the habits that would make the next change possible. A way of looking beyond the shore without forgetting that the shore was always the beginning. A vulnerable island does not become outward-looking because it feels safe. It looks outward because safety is never complete. Britain's later turn toward the sea was rooted in this uneasy condition. The island had land to farm, rivers to follow, forests to use, and communities that could live for generations without imagining the wider world in imperial terms. Yet the horizon was always close. Beyond it were other peoples, other markets, other threats, and other possibilities. For a kingdom on an island, the edge of the land was not a distant frontier. It was part of daily awareness. Coasts were places where fish were taken, goods were exchanged, strangers arrived, and danger sometimes came without warning. Over many centuries, this made the sea more than scenery. It became a habit of attention. Britain learned, slowly and unevenly, that to understand its own security, it had to understand what lay beyond its shores. This was not a sudden national decision. It was a long accumulation of practical lessons. If ships could bring invaders, ships could also watch for them. If the sea could interrupt trade, it could also carry goods farther than roads. If foreign powers could use water to threaten the island could use water to reach foreign powers first. The same logic that began as defense could later support expansion. Here the story returns to a very old human pattern. Human beings have always lived inside limits set by body and landscape. A person can only walk so far in a day, carry so much weight, endure so much cold, and remember so many safe routes without help from others. Communities survived by turning repeated pressure into shared knowledge. In Britain, pressure came from the island's position. It was near Europe but not fully part of the continent. It could receive influence, invasion, and trade, but every connection had to cross water. That crossing made contact selective, costly, and meaningful. Over time, people who ruled Britain could not think only in terms of fields and castles. They also had to think in terms of ports, fleets, tides, and choke points. The outward turn was therefore not born from confidence alone. It was born from vulnerability organized into policy. A land power deep inside Europe might measure strength by cavalry, roads, fortresses, and borders. Britain could never ignore those things, but it had an additional problem. Its greatest border moved with the weather. A storm could defend it better than an army. A calm sea could expose it more quickly than a broken wall. This uncertainty shaped the political imagination. To control the water near the island meant reducing fear at home. To control routes farther away meant increasing trade. To control ports abroad meant extending influence without always holding vast inland territories. These ideas would mature much later, but their roots lay in the island's basic condition. Britain had to look outward, because the source of danger and opportunity often came from the same direction. The transformation was slow enough that no single generation could see its full shape. Farmers still watched seasons. Fishermen still watched tides. Merchants watched prices. Rulers watched rivals. But together, these ordinary acts formed a wider pattern. The island began to treat distance as something that could be studied, crossed, priced, defended, and eventually governed. This is one of the quiet steps from geography to empire. Not a straight path, and not a destiny, but a change in how space was imagined. The sea was no longer only the place where land ended. It became a field of movement, risk, and calculation. In the deeper human sense, this was an extension of the same capacity that carried our species across mountains, deserts, rivers, and coastlines. The ability to make mental maps before the body moves. People survive by imagining the next source of food, the next shelter, the next danger, the next season. States do something similar on a larger scale. Britain's later power would depend on maps, finance, guns, laws, trade, and violence. But before all of that, it depended on learning to think beyond the immediate ground. The island's weakness was not erased. It was reorganized. A place that feared arrival from the sea gradually became a place that sent ships outward. A place at the edge of Europe gradually learned to use that edge as a starting point. And this is why the first movement in the real story of Britain's empire is not conquest but orientation, the slow turning of a vulnerable island toward the open water. When Roman authority withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, the island did not suddenly become empty, nor did it fall into a simple darkness. People still farmed the same fields, repaired the same roads when they could, crossed the same rivers, and lived among the remains of towns, walls, villas, forts, and marketplaces left by a larger imperial system. But something important had changed. The island was no longer held inside the daily machinery of Rome. Soldiers were no longer reliably paid by imperial command. Long-distance administration weakened, coinage became less common, urban life changed in many places. Written records became thinner, leaving later generations with fewer clear voices from the people who lived through the transition. What remained was not silence, but a different kind of evidence. Settlement patterns, objects, burials, place names, ruined buildings, and the slow reshaping of power. This matters for the real story of Britain because empire did not grow from an unbroken line of strength. It grew from a land that had already experienced what it meant to be inside someone else's empire, then outside it. Rome had taught Britain lessons without making Britain Roman forever. It showed how roads could connect distant places, how taxes could support armies, how law could shape daily life, and how a frontier could be guarded by organized power. Yet when that structure faded, local communities had to return to older human problems: food, protection, kinship, land, and trust. In that sense, post-Roman Britain brings the story close to the deeper beginning of human society. Before states become large, people must solve small questions again and again. Who controls the harvest? Who can be called for defense? Which leader can gather followers? Which routes remain safe? Which memory of the past still has value when the old authority is gone? The Roman past did not vanish from the ground. Roads still cut across the island. Hadrian's Wall still stood in the north, though its meaning changed. Former towns still held traces of order, even when their old civic life declined. Christianity, already present in parts of Roman Britain, continued in some communities, though its reach and form varied. The Latin language left marks, but the island's speech, identity, and politics did not remain fixed. Across eastern and southern Britain, Germanic-speaking peoples from across the North Sea settled over time alongside existing populations. The details differed by region, and historians avoid reducing this change to one simple invasion story. It involved migration, conflict, alliance, cultural change, and the gradual formation of new kingdoms. That complexity is important because Britain's later power would depend on a habit that can already be seen here: absorbing outside forces, resisting some, adapting to others, and turning disruption into new political forms. The end of Roman rule did not create unity. It created a landscape where power was smaller, nearer, and more contested. A person's world might be shaped less by a distant emperor and more by a local ruler, a fortified place, a kin group, or a church community. The island became a mosaic of authority. This fragmentation was not weakness in only one sense. It was also training in competition. Communities learned to survive without the full protection of a continental empire. Leaders had to build loyalty from land, warfare, marriage, tribute, religion, and reputation. The memory of Rome remained like a shadow of scale, proof that large systems were possible, but also proof that they could fail. For a small island at the edge of Europe, this was a hard lesson. Power could arrive from outside and organize life for centuries, then recede, leaving people to rebuild meaning from what remained. That is why the withdrawal of Rome belongs in the opening movement of Britain's imperial story. It shows the island not as a natural ruler, but as a former frontier, a place shaped by being ruled, exposed, reorganized, and divided. Long before Britain sent ships across the world, it had to live among the ruins of another empire and learn what happens when a great system no longer holds. After Roman authority faded, Britain became a land of many smaller powers, each trying to hold ground, gather loyalty, and survive among neighbours who were often rivals. There was no single Britain in the political sense. There were Brittonic communities in the west and north, emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the east and south, Pictish power in northern regions, Irish influence across the western seas, and later Scandinavian pressure from across the North Sea. These names can sound fixed when spoken today, but at the time they described shifting worlds of language, kinship, warfare, marriage, tribute, religion, and local memory. A ruler's strength depended on people, land, armed followers, food supply, and the ability to make alliances before enemies did. This was not yet the world of Oceanic Empire. It was a smaller, harder world where power had to be built close to the body: a hall, a field, a road, a river crossing, a defended hill, a winter store of grain, a group of men willing to fight, and families willing to remain loyal. In this way, post-Roman Britain returned to an older human pattern. Before large states can project power across distance, people must first create trust near home. They must decide who belongs, who leads, who pays, who fights, and who remembers the dead. The island's political future grew from these basic pressures. The small kingdoms did not merely fight because rulers were ambitious. They fought because land was wealth, food was security, and followers expected protection and reward. A weak ruler could lose people as well as territory. A strong ruler could draw warriors, clerics, craftsmen, and dependents into a larger household of power. Over generations, these local struggles formed recognizable kingdoms such as Kent, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and others, though their borders and influence rose and fell. Christianity became increasingly important in this process, not only as belief, but as organization. Churches and monasteries connected local rulers to wider networks of learning, writing, diplomacy, and legitimacy. A king who supported the church could appear less like a temporary war leader and more like a ruler placed within a moral and historical order. Written law codes, royal genealogies, and religious patronage helped turn personal rule into something more durable. Yet violence never disappeared from the foundation. Raids, succession disputes, tribute demands, and battles remained common features of political life. This mixture of faith, force, memory, and administration helped shape a habit that later mattered deeply to Britain's rise, the habit of turning local competition into stronger institutions. Each kingdom learned from pressure. Defeat could destroy a dynasty, but it could also teach survivors how to organize better. Alliance could protect a border, but it could also prepare a future claim. Marriage could join families, but it could also carry rivalry into the next generation. The island was divided, yet the divisions created a constant testing ground for leadership. This mattered because later expansion abroad required more than ships. It required states able to raise money, command people, justify action, and absorb conflict without collapsing immediately. The roots of that capacity were not clean or peaceful. They grew in a landscape where communities were repeatedly forced to adapt. The same human need that once tied small bands to food, shelter, and kin now appeared in political form. Groups sought safety by making larger groups. Families joined lordships. Lordships gathered into kingdoms. Kingdoms competed for wider authority. Identity slowly formed through pressure from inside and outside. People might think of themselves through kin, region, language, ruler, or faith before they imagined any broader national belonging. Still, the island's political map was slowly teaching its rulers that power could be layered. A king could rule directly in one place, influence another through tribute, and claim spiritual or symbolic authority elsewhere. That idea, modest at first, would later expand in scale. Britain's empire would one day depend on ruling different places in different ways, with unequal rights, unequal burdens, and unequal closeness to the centre. The pattern did not begin overseas. A distant echo can be heard in these early centuries, when authority across the island was already uneven, negotiated, and contested. The real story of Britain's rise therefore passes through this age of division because division trained political imagination. The island did not move from weakness to empire in a straight line. It moved through fragments, rival courts, shifting borders, and repeated attempts to make order from insecurity. Before Britain could look outward with lasting force, it first had to learn what power meant among its own divided peoples. A divided land can look weak from far away, but close to the ground it can also become a school of pressure. After Rome, Britain did not move toward unity with calm steps. It was pulled by rival rulers, threatened from different seas, shaped by languages that overlapped, and held together only in temporary ways by victory, marriage, tribute, belief, and fear. This long experience of broken authority mattered because later power was not built by people who had never known disorder. It was built by societies that had learned, slowly and often painfully, how to organize amid disorder. The kingdoms that rose across the island were not equal in strength or stability. Some expanded for a time, then fell back. Others disappeared from memory except through names, graves, coins, laws, or hostile accounts written by others. Northumbria could shine as a centre of learning and royal ambition. Mercia could dominate wide stretches of the Midlands. Wessex, under repeated pressure, would later become central to the making of an English kingdom. Yet none of these developments should be treated as destiny. They were human responses to immediate problems: food, defence, loyalty, inheritance, and the need to make strangers into subjects. This returns the story to the deeper beginning of humanity. Long before kingdoms existed, human groups survived by forming bonds large enough to protect children, share labour, remember roots, and face danger together. In early medieval Britain, that same ancient problem appeared on a larger political scale. A ruler had to make many households act as one body, at least for a season. A law had to turn conflict into payment or punishment before revenge tore communities apart. A church had to preserve memory, teach obedience, and offer meaning beyond the next battle. Competition forced experiments in organization. Kings issued laws, lords gathered followers. Monasteries stored books and food. Fortified places guarded routes. Tribute marked inequality between stronger and weaker powers. Diplomacy mattered because no ruler could fight every enemy at once. Even violence created information. A failed campaign revealed weak supply lines. A successful defense increased reputation. A broken alliance taught the cost of trust. Over generations, this made political life more practical and more layered. The island's rulers learned that authority was not only a sword held in the hand, it was also a promise, a tax, a road, a priest, a marriage, a written word, and a memory repeated until people accepted it as order. The arrival of Viking armies and settlements made this lesson sharper. Attacks from the sea exposed how vulnerable separate kingdoms could be. Some rulers paid, some fought, some negotiated, and some lost everything. Pressure from outside encouraged new forms of coordination inside. The defense of land required burhs, local obligations, military planning, and a clearer sense of common rule. In this environment, the idea of a wider English kingship became more believable, not because old divisions vanished, but because danger made wider unity useful. Here again, the human origin of the story is visible. People rarely create larger communities from pure imagination. They often do it because smaller circles can no longer protect enough life. The family needs the village. The village needs the lord. The kingdom needs wider allegiance when danger grows. Britain's later global reach would depend on this earlier training in scale. It had to learn how to bind unequal regions, manage rival interests, gather resources, and present power as protection. The lesson was imperfect, and it came with exclusion, violence, and loss. But it left a lasting pattern. A divided island became accustomed to competition, and competition rewarded those who could coordinate better than their rivals. Before Britain could project force across oceans, it had first learned to survive in a crowded island world where every border, every coast, and every alliance reminded people that power was never still. The year 1066 did not create Britain's empire, but it changed the machinery through which power could be held in England. When William, Duke of Normandy, defeated Harold Godwinson at Hastings and became king, the island did not suddenly become a modern state. Most people still lived close to the land. They still measured life by harvest, weather, animals, rent, hunger, kinship, and the authority of those above them. Yet above these ordinary lives, a new ruling order began to take shape. The Norman conquest replaced much of the Old English elite with a French-speaking aristocracy tied to the new king by land, service, and obligation. Castles appeared as visible signs of control. Estates were redistributed. Bishops and abbots changed. Law, lordship, and military power became more tightly connected to royal authority. This matters because later empire required more than ships and ambition. It required the ability to record land, extract resources, command loyalty, and turn scattered local wealth into organized power. The Norman kings did not invent this from nothing. Anglo-Saxon England already had traditions of kingship, taxation, written administration, shire organization, and royal law. The conquest built upon some older structures while reshaping who benefited from them. England after 1066 was not simply conquered chaos, and it was not clean continuity. It was a new ruling system placed over an older social body, forcing memory, land, language, and obedience into new arrangements. The deeper human beginning is still visible here. Since early human communities first settled into more permanent landscapes, control over land has meant control over food, labour, shelter, and future generations. A field is never only soil. It is the work of bodies, the memory of families, the place where children grow, and the source from which rulers demand support. After 1066, land in England became the central language of power in a sharper way. To hold land from the king meant owing service. To lose land meant losing security, status, and voice. The ordinary dependence of human life on place was transformed into a political ladder reaching upward toward the crown. One of the clearest signs of this new order was the Great Survey, later known as Domesday Book, completed in the late 11th century. It was not a modern census in the full sense, and it did not record every human life equally, but it showed a strong desire to know what could be taxed, who held what land was worth, and how resources might be claimed. In a quiet way, this was one root of future imperial power, the habit of making territory legible to authority. A ruler who can measure wealth can demand from it. A ruler who can identify obligations can mobilize them. A ruler who can place local society into written categories can govern from a distance more effectively than one who depends only on memory and personal presence. The conquest also tied England more deeply into the politics of continental Europe. Its rulers held lands and ambitions across the Channel, making the sea again both bridge and burden. England was no longer only looking inward after centuries of fragmentation. Its elite world now spoke across water, fought across water, married across water, and drew culture, law, and conflict from both sides of the Channel. This did not yet point toward the Atlantic Empire of later centuries, but it changed England's political horizon. The island's rulers had to think in more than one landscape at once. They were kings in England, lords in France, and competitors in a wider European order. That habit of layered power would echo much later when Britain ruled different territories through different systems. The Norman conquest, therefore, belongs to the real story not because it made empire inevitable, but because it strengthened the link between land, record, military obligation, and central rule. It taught England that power could be mapped downward into villages and upward into the crown. Before Britain could reach across oceans, one of its core kingdoms had to learn how to hold itself more tightly. Norman power in England was not only carried by soldiers, it was built into stone, landholding, oath, record, and fear. Across the landscape, castles changed what authority looked like. Earlier fortified places had existed, but the Norman castle became a sharper political instrument. A mound, a timber tower, a stone keep, a walled courtyard, and a garrison could make royal or lordly power visible from a distance. For ordinary people, a castle was not just architecture. It was a reminder that force had settled nearby and intended to remain. It watched roads, rivers, towns, and estates. It protected some people while intimidating others. It helped a small ruling elite hold a larger population whose language, customs, and memories were often different from their own. This is one of the cold realities behind the growth of strong states. Authority becomes durable when it can stay after the army has marched away. A fortress does that. A tax record does that. A legal claim does that. The conquest joined these tools together with unusual force. The new aristocracy received estates from the king, but land was not a simple gift. It carried duties, military service, council, payments, and loyalty. Local power became tied to royal favour, and royal favour depended on keeping the new order intact. The countryside remained full of human labour, as it always had. Fields still needed hands, animals still needed care, mills still needed grain, and households still needed warmth. In the deepest human sense, the system rested on bodies working the land. Since the first farming societies, political power has often grown from the ability to claim a share of other people's harvests. England, after the conquest, made that claim more organised. Lords needed peasants to produce. The king needed lords to serve. Churches needed income to pray, build, teach, and write. Each level depended on the level below it, and the burden eventually reached those closest to soil and weather. Taxation and obligation were not abstract things to them. They could mean grain taken, labour owed, animals counted, rents demanded, or sons drawn into service. The Domesday Survey showed how deeply rulers wanted to know the productive body of the kingdom. It recorded manors, holders, values, mills, plough teams, livestock in some cases, and categories of people according to status and obligation. Its purpose was practical, not compassionate. It helped authority see resources. That habit would matter far beyond medieval England. Later imperial systems would also depend on turning living places into lists, values, maps, offices, and claims. The first step was not crossing an ocean, but learning how to make a village readable to power. castles and records worked with law. After 1066, older English customs did not disappear entirely, but they were filtered through Norman rule and royal courts. Disputes over land, inheritance, crime, and service could be pulled into systems that strengthened the crown's reach. Over time, English kings used courts, sheriffs, writs, and financial offices to make authority travel farther than a single ruler's body could go. This touches another ancient human limit. A person can only be present in one place. A ruler who depends only on personal presence rules weakly at distance. Writing, officials, roads, seals, money, and law extend the body of power. They allow command to move where the king is absent. In Norman and later medieval England, this extension was uneven, contested, and often resisted, but it gave the kingdom a stronger administrative spine than many fragmented territories. The result was not freedom for everyone, and it was not a peaceful society. It was a harder structure of control, built from conquest and compromise. Yet in the long path toward empire, it mattered because England learned how to concentrate resources inside the island before projecting force outside it. The castle taught occupation, the survey taught measurement, the tax taught extraction, the court taught reach. The ruling class taught that a small group could govern a larger population if it controlled land, law, violence, and memory. Centuries later, those same principles would appear overseas in different forms, carrying old habits into new worlds. The strength that emerged after the Norman conquest was not simply the strength of one king. It was the slow hardening of a system that could gather land, money, military service, and obedience into forms that lasted beyond a single lifetime. Medieval England still contained rebellion, famine, local violence, weak rulers, and deep inequality. No kingdom in this age should be imagined as smooth or fully controlled. Yet, compared with many looser political landscapes, England developed tools that helped royal authority reach into ordinary life with unusual persistence. Sheriffs collected revenues, courts carried royal claims into local disputes, written orders moved under seals. Forest laws, feudal obligations, inheritance customs, and financial records tied people and land to layers of rule. This did not make England gentle, it made it more governable from above. That difference matters because a global empire cannot be built only from brave sailors or ambitious merchants. It needs a home structure able to tax, borrow, command, punish, reward, and remember. The deeper human origin of this is simple. Human beings began as bodies needing food and safety, but over long time they learned to store obligations outside the body, in marks, words, laws, buildings, rituals, and accounts. A promise remembered by one person can die with that person. A promise written, witnessed, sealed, and enforced can outlive generations. Medieval England became increasingly skilled at this kind of stored authority. Power was no longer only the presence of a lord in a hall. It could appear as a document, a demand, a court judgment, a coin payment, or a summons to serve. War also forced organisation. English kings fought in Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and France, and these conflicts varied in purpose, scale, and outcome. They were not the same as later overseas empire, but they taught rulers how expensive distance could be. Armies needed food, horses, ships, wages, weapons, and legal justification. Campaigns exposed the limits of royal income. Defeat created debt and political anger. Victory often required deeper extraction from society. Over time, rulers had to negotiate with nobles, towns, clergy, and landholders for money and support. This tension helped shape institutions such as Parliament, not as a modern democracy, but as a place where consent, taxation, grievance, and political bargaining could become linked. The crown wanted resources, powerful subjects wanted recognition of rights and interests. Out of that friction came a more complex state, one that could sometimes mobilize more effectively because it had learned to bargain as well as command. This is important for the story of Britain's later rise. Empire would depend not only on force, but on finance and legitimacy. A state that can ask for money in a repeatable way, explain why it needs it, and return later for more, has a different kind of endurance from a ruler who only seizes what is nearby. The human beginning is visible again in this movement from immediate taking to organized expectation. Early communities survived by sharing food, remembering debts, and trusting that help given today might be returned tomorrow. Larger states turned that old social logic into taxation, credit, law, and obligation, often with pressure and inequality built into the process. England's medieval development also brought a growing awareness of neighbouring lands as fields of ambition and anxiety. Wales was drawn more tightly under English rule. Ireland experienced English intervention and settlement from the 12th century onward, with long consequences. Scotland remained a separate kingdom despite repeated conflict. France pulled English rulers into generations of war and dynastic claims. These struggles did not create a global empire, but they trained ruling elites in expansion, resistance, administration, and the difficulty of ruling people who did not simply become obedient because a claim had been made over them. The lesson was not always learned wisely. Often, it produced harsher control and deeper conflict. Still, it shaped the political muscles of the kingdom. By the late medieval world, England was no longer merely a vulnerable island learning to survive after Rome. It had become a kingdom with stronger records, stronger law, stronger fiscal habits, and a sharper sense that power required organization across distance. The future empire would still need the sea, trade, industry, violence, and opportunity. But before those forces could work on a global scale, England had already learned one quiet discipline: how to turn land and people into a system that could sustain ambition. England's path toward the sea was shaped not only by opportunity, but by repeated frustration on land. For many centuries, English rulers were drawn deeply into the politics of France and the wider European mainland. This was not strange. After the Norman conquest, the ruling elite had lands, language, family ties, and ambitions across the Channel. The water between England and France did not make the two worlds separate in any simple way. It connected them through war, marriage, inheritance, trade, diplomacy, and rivalry. English kings could look across the narrow sea and see not a distant foreign shore, but claims they believed they could defend or recover. Yet those claims were expensive. Holding territory on the continent required armies, money, supplies, local loyalty, and constant attention. A king could win a battle and still struggle to hold the countryside. He could claim a crown and still face a population whose daily loyalties did not follow his words. The old human limit returned in political form. Bodies can only be fed, moved, sheltered, and commanded if a chain of practical support exists beneath the ambition. Every army on the mainland needed bread, horses, ships, wages, weapons, and time. Every campaign placed pressure on fields and households back home. Every failure reminded England that land power in Europe was difficult for an island kingdom to sustain. The long wars with France showed this clearly. English victories could be dramatic, and some became powerful memories, but victories did not erase the deeper geography. France had a larger land base, wider resources, and political depth that England could not easily match over generations. The 100 Years' War was not one continuous fight, and its causes were complex, involving dynastic claims, feudal rights, trade, and royal prestige. Still, one result was plain enough. England's effort to be a major continental land power became harder to maintain. By the mid-15th century, most English-held territories in France had been lost, with Calais remaining for a time as a symbolic and strategic foothold. When Calais was lost in the 16th century, it carried emotional weight because it closed a long habit of English presence on the mainland. This did not mean England stopped caring about Europe. It never did. The island remained tied to European politics through religion, trade, alliances, fear of invasion, and balance of power. But the repeated difficulty of holding land across the Channel helped shift the scale of imagination. If the continent could not be possessed in the old way, then the sea itself became more important as the space where England could compete without needing to march endlessly across foreign fields. This shift was not automatic, and it was not morally clean. It grew from pressure, failure, and calculation. The deeper beginning of human history helps explain why. Human communities have always adjusted when one path becomes too costly. Hunters change routes when herds move. Farmers alter crops when weather changes. Villages migrate, merge, defend, or trade when survival requires it. States do something similar. though with larger consequences and greater harm when power expands. England's rulers and merchants slowly learned that influence did not have to mean holding neighbouring farmland forever. It could mean controlling ships, ports, loans, sea lanes, customs duties, and overseas markets. The island's weakness on the mainland could become a reason to value maritime strength more intensely. The failure of continental ambition also affected political culture at home. Wars demanded taxation, taxation demanded negotiation. Negotiation exposed the tension between crown, nobles, towns, and landholders. Defeat could weaken royal authority and sharpen internal conflict, as seen in the instability that followed the later phases of the wars with France. A kingdom that could not easily dominate Europe by land had to rethink where its strength might lie. Its coastline, once a vulnerable edge, began to look like a field of movement. Its ports began to matter not only for local trade, but for national strategy. Its sailors, merchants, shipbuilders, and financiers became more important to the future of power. The real story here is not that England failed in Europe and instantly chose empire. History rarely moves in that neat way. The story is slower. A kingdom spent centuries trying to hold influence across a narrow sea, learned the cost of continental war, and gradually turned more attention toward the water that had always surrounded it. The land across the channel remained important, but it no longer offered a secure path to greatness. The sea, dangerous and uncertain as it was, offered another direction. The turn toward maritime power did not begin as a romantic love of the sea. It grew from practical needs: defence, trade, food, communication, and rivalry. England's rulers had learned that armies on the European mainland were costly and uncertain, while ships could protect the island, carry goods, and keep watch over the waters that enemies also needed to cross. A strong navy was not only a tool for attack, it was a form of shelter. For an island kingdom, the first question of security was often not how many soldiers could stand on a field, but whether hostile ships could be stopped before they reached the shore. This made ports, shipyards, sailors, timber, rope, cannon, navigation, and coastal administration increasingly important. The sea began to gather many kinds of knowledge into one national concern. A fishing community knew tides and weather. A merchant knew prices and cargo. A shipwright knew wood, shape, weight, and balance. A ruler knew that without ships, every coast was a door left open. These different forms of attention slowly converged into maritime strategy. The deeper human beginning is still present here. Human beings have always survived by extending the body through tools. A spear lengthens the arm. A basket extends carrying strength. A map extends memory. A ship extends the footstep across water. It allows bodies that cannot swim across a sea to move as if the sea were a road. England's future depended heavily on that ancient human habit, using tools to cross limits that the body alone could not cross. Yet ships required organisation. They were expensive to build, difficult to maintain, and dangerous to operate. They needed skilled crews, reliable supplies, trained officers, and places to repair. Naval strength was therefore not only wooden hulls moving across water, it was forests, taxes, dockyards, law, wages, discipline, and the ability to plan beyond one season. During the Tudor period, especially under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, the Crown gave increasing attention to naval defence and shipbuilding, though later growth would be broader and more sustained. The break with Rome, religious conflict, and rivalry with Catholic powers made the waters around England feel more dangerous. Spain, with its wide imperial reach and powerful fleets, became a major rival. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was remembered as a defining moment, but it should not be treated as a simple birth of empire. Weather, tactics, logistics, and Spanish difficulties all mattered. England did not suddenly rule the oceans afterward. What changed was confidence, memory, and the belief that an island could survive by mastering the approaches to its own shores. Trade deepened the same habit. Ports such as London, Bristol, Plymouth, and others connected local life to wider markets. Wool and cloth, fish, wine, salt, timber, grain, and later colonial goods moved through networks of exchange. Merchants had to think in distances that farmers rarely needed to imagine. A failed voyage could ruin investors. A successful voyage could bring profit, news, and new ambition. Risk became something that could be shared through partnerships, credit, insurance, and chartered ventures. This was a quiet transformation in the meaning of power. Land remained important, but wealth was increasingly imagined as something that could move. A cargo could cross borders. A bill of exchange could travel faster than a cart of silver. A port could gather information from many shores. Once a kingdom begins to value moving wealth, it begins to value the routes that wealth uses. The sea then becomes economic territory, even before formal rule appears. This is why maritime Britain developed from both fear and desire. Fear asked for defence. Desire asked for markets. Rivalry asked for ships that could fight and trade. Geography placed England at the edge of Europe, facing the Atlantic, but geography alone did not build docks or train crews. People did that, through choices shaped by danger and opportunity. The island slowly learned that control of water near home could protect fields, towns, and households, while control of water far away could bring goods, influence, and leverage. The same tide that once marked the edge of safety now marked the beginning of a larger political imagination. By the time England began to think more seriously in maritime terms, the sea was no longer only a dangerous border. It had become a space where politics, money, and military force could meet. A ship could carry cloth one season, soldiers the next, and royal instructions after that. A harbour could be a place of trade, but also a place of surveillance. A convoy could protect merchants, yet the same protection could become pressure against a rival. On land, power often appeared as a castle, a manor, a court, or a field. At sea, power was harder to see because it moved. It existed in routes, winds, harbours, crews, charts, credit, cannon, and timing. To rule water completely was impossible, but to influence movement across water could change the fate of kingdoms. England slowly learned that the sea could be treated as a political landscape, even though it had no fences and no harvest. This was not a natural gift. It was a human invention built upon an older human habit. Since our earliest ancestors moved through forests, coasts, rivers, and plains, survival depended on understanding spaces that could not be owned in a simple way. A hunting path, a shoreline, or a river crossing mattered because people remembered how to use it. The sea demanded the same kind of memory on a larger and more dangerous scale. Mariners had to know currents, stars, shoals, weather, and ships under stress. Merchants had to know safe ports, profitable cargoes, and wars that could close a route overnight. Rulers had to know that a sea lane was not empty space. It was a line of connection between food, weapons, people, money, and influence. Once this was understood, maritime strategy became more than defence. It became a way of shaping distance. England could not easily dominate the inland spaces of Europe, but it could compete along edges, channels, estuaries, ports, islands, and ocean crossings. These edges were points where goods changed hands, ships took shelter, and news moved. Control did not always require direct rule over a large population. Sometimes it meant holding a harbour, protecting a route, denying access to an enemy, or making merchants depend on English ships and English credit. This kind of power suited an island state that had learned from both fear and failure. It also changed the imagination of wealth. A kingdom tied only to land thinks first of acres, tenants, crops, and rents. A kingdom tied to the sea begins to think of cargo, passage, insurance, customs duties, distant markets, and naval reach. The body of the ordinary human being remained at the centre of it all. Sailors endured cold, hunger, cramped decks, illness, and storms. Dock workers loaded cargo with muscle and rope. Farmers produced food that fed crews. Artisans made barrels, sails, weapons, and tools. The language of maritime power rested on physical tasks repeated by people whose names rarely entered history. This matters because empire later appeared on maps as coloured territory, but before it was territory, it was work, risk, and bodies moving through space. The sea also taught England that distance could be organised without being fully possessed. A fleet could appear, withdraw, and return. A trading company could create a foothold. A treaty could open a port. A naval victory could protect commerce without annexing a country. These flexible forms of influence became central to Britain's later expansion. They allowed power to stretch unevenly, touching some places lightly through trade and others heavily through conquest or administration. Nothing about this process was innocent. Maritime power could protect, but it could also seize. Trade could connect societies, but it could also prepare domination. Ships carried goods, but also guns, disease, forced labor systems, and claims that would reshape the lives of millions. The sea did not make Britain moral or destined. It gave Britain a medium through which organized ambition could travel farther than before. By the time oceanic expansion became possible, England had already learned one essential lesson. Water was not simply the space between lands. It was a field of power, and whoever understood movement across it could begin to influence worlds far beyond the shore. The rise of British power cannot be understood through kings and battles alone. Beneath the visible surface of flags and fleets, another kind of strength was forming in counting houses, port offices, warehouses, workshops, and crowded quays. Merchants learned to treat distance as risk that could be priced. Shipowners learned that one voyage might fail, but many voyages shared by many investors could spread danger across a wider circle. Lenders learned that money sent out today could return months later as profit, cargo, debt, or loss. This was not the grand language of empire yet, it was the quieter language of trade. England and later Britain began to build power through people who did not always command armies but understood movement. The movement of wool, cloth, fish, timber, sugar, spices, silver, tobacco, and information. A port city was more than a place where ships arrived. It was a listening device. News came with sailors, prices came with merchants. Rumours of war, harvest failure, piracy, disease, and opportunity moved along the docks before they reached royal courts. This kind of knowledge mattered because empire would later depend on knowing where goods were needed, where rivals were weak, where credit could be raised, and where ships could safely anchor. The deeper human beginning is still present in this commercial world. Early human communities survived by exchanging what one group had for what another group lacked. Obsidian, shells, pigments, salt, tools, food, and stories moved across landscapes long before modern states existed. Exchange was never only economic. It created trust, obligation, rivalry, and memory. In the same way, early modern trade connected Britain to wider worlds before formal political control appeared. A merchant did not need to rule a coastline in order to depend on it. A lender did not need to see a distant harbour in order to profit from it. This was one of the quiet changes that made empire possible. Power could begin as a relationship before it became a flag. Banking and credit made that relationship stronger. Ships were expensive, voyages took time. Cargo could be lost to storms, war, shipwreck, theft, or market collapse. No single household could safely carry every risk alone. So merchants formed partnerships, borrowed money, bought shares, insured cargoes, and developed habits of calculation that turned uncertainty into organized expectation. Insurance did not remove danger. It made danger bearable enough for more voyages to be attempted. Credit did not create goods from nothing. It allowed people to act before wealth had returned. This changed the scale of ambition. A kingdom with credit could prepare beyond its immediate cash. A merchant network with trust could connect distant shores through promises written on paper. Here again, the ancient human body sits beneath the system. A sailor's hunger, a dockworker's hands, a weaver's eyes, a clerk's memory, and a farmer's harvest all became elements of a larger machine of movement. The machine looked financial from above, but from below it was still muscle, fatigue, weather, and need. London became increasingly important in this process, especially as overseas trade grew. Other ports also mattered, each with its own connections and specializations. Trade with Europe remained central, but Atlantic and wider oceanic routes changed the horizon. Merchants and rulers began to see that wealth could be drawn not only from land inside the kingdom, but from circulation beyond it. Customs duties gave the state a reason to care about commerce. Naval protection gave merchants a reason to support stronger fleets. Profits from trade gave investors a reason to seek new routes and privileges. None of this was morally neutral. The same tools that could support ordinary exchange could also support exploitation, monopoly, coerced labour, and conquest. But the mechanism is important to understand. Before Britain became a global empire in a formal sense, It became increasingly skilled at organizing risk, capital, ships, and information. The ocean was no longer only crossed by courage. It was crossed by contracts, ledgers, loans, and shared expectation. This was a new kind of reach, quieter than battle but often more enduring, because it taught Britain how to turn distance into a system of profit. As trade widened, England did not rely only on individual merchants sending out separate ships into uncertain waters. A more powerful instrument appeared, the chartered company. This kind of company was not a private business in the modern simple sense, and it was not the state itself. It stood in between. A monarch could grant a company special rights to trade in certain regions, to organize voyages, to raise money, to make agreements, and in some cases to defend its interests with force. The company gathered investors, ships, officers, clerks, sailors, warehouses, and legal privileges into one body that could act across distance. This mattered deeply because the ocean was too large and too risky for ordinary trade habits alone. A single voyage might bring profit, but a chartered company could build repeated presence. It could return to the same waters, learn the same ports, bargain with local rulers, build relationships, request military protection, and keep records over time. In this way, commercial ambition began to take on a political shape. The deeper human beginning is still visible beneath this structure. Human beings first survived by cooperating in groups larger than one body could manage alone. One person could carry only so much food, remember only so many paths, or face only so many dangers. Groups made survival larger than the individual. Chartered companies did something similar at the level of trade and power. They pooled risk, memory, money, and labour. They allowed people who stayed in London to take part in journeys they would never personally make. A clerk writing in an office, an investor buying a share, a sailor climbing rigging in cold wind, and a distant agent negotiating in a foreign port all became pieces of the same extended organism. This was one of the strange developments of early modern power. A legal body could behave almost like a person, making decisions, holding rights, owing debts, and pursuing profit over generations. Companies such as the Muscovy Company, the Levant Company, the East India Company, and others reflected a world in which trade was becoming organized through privilege and monopoly. Some looked toward northern routes, some toward the Mediterranean and Near East, and some toward the Indian Ocean and Asia. Their aims differed, and their success varied. But the larger pattern was clear. England was learning that influence abroad could begin through protected commerce. A company might start by seeking spices, textiles, metals, or other goods, yet its need to secure trade could pull it into diplomacy, fortification, warfare, and territorial claims. The line between merchant and ruler could become dangerously thin. This was not unique to England. Other European powers used similar instruments, and Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, and French networks all shaped the wider competitive world. England's rise must be understood within that crowded field, not as an isolated miracle. Competition pushed companies to seek advantage. Advantage required information. Information required agents, maps, translators, local allies, and repeated contact. Over time, a trading post could become a fortified factory, a contract could become leverage, a debt could become political pressure, a dispute over goods could become a military question. The company form allowed the crown to extend influence without immediately paying the full cost of direct rule. This was useful for a state that wanted wealth and reach but could not manage every distant venture by itself. It also created moral distance. Violence, exploitation, and coercion could be carried out under commercial language, as if the pursuit of profit was separate from the suffering it caused. The ordinary human body again carried the burden. Sailors died on long voyages. Local workers were drawn into unequal systems. Communities abroad were forced to negotiate with organizations backed by foreign ships and weapons. Investors saw numbers on paper. Others felt the pressure in land, labor, hunger, and law. This is why the chartered company is central to the real story of Britain's empire. It shows that empire did not always arrive first as a soldier planting a flag. Sometimes it arrived as a warehouse, a contract, a monopoly, a protected harbour, a loan, or a dispute over trade. The company taught Britain how to stretch authority through business before formal government took full control. It turned distance into administration, profit into policy, and commerce into a path that could lead, step by step, toward rule. Empire often begins before it has the appearance of empire. It can begin with a document, a debt, a protected voyage, a warehouse beside a foreign shore, or a small group of men counting goods under the authority of a distant crown. In Britain's case, expansion did not move only through armies marching under royal command. It also moved through contracts, charters, ports, cargoes, and promises written into law. This is one of the most important truths behind the rise of Britain as a global empire. Power could travel inside business. A company could seek profit, but profit required security. Security required ships, forts, armed guards, local agreements, and sometimes violence. Once those things appeared, trade no longer remained only trade. It became a structure of pressure. A port where goods were exchanged could become a place where rules were imposed. A loan could become dependence. A monopoly could close choices for others. A dispute over cargo could invite military force. The language might still be commercial, but the effects could become political. This was not a sudden transformation, and it did not happen everywhere in the same way. In some places, British influence remained mostly maritime and commercial for long periods. In others, trade became closely tied to territorial control, taxation, and administration. What linked these different cases was a habit of turning relationships into systems. The deeper human beginning of this pattern is very old. Human beings first survived by exchanging help, food, tools, and knowledge. Trust allowed small groups to do what one body could not do alone. But when exchange is enlarged by ships, money, legal privilege, and weapons, the same human capacity can become something far more unequal. A promise between neighbours is one thing. A contract backed by a navy is another. Britain's commercial expansion rested on this difference. It could present itself as exchange while carrying the weight of organised force behind it. Ports and trading stations became points of contact, but also points of leverage. They gathered information about prices, rulers, languages, resources, rival powers, and local conflicts. Information then shaped the next voyage, the next negotiation, the next fortification, and the next demand for protection. In this way, knowledge itself became a kind of cargo. A ship did not return only with goods. It returned with maps, rumours, disease reports, political intelligence, weather experience, and memories of what could be attempted again. Over time, these fragments helped Britain imagine distant regions not as unknown spaces, but as places that could be entered, priced, compared, and influenced. That mental change was central to empire. Before land could be ruled, it first had to be made thinkable from far away. Before a distant society could be dominated, it had to be reduced in the mind of outsiders into roots, resources, risks, and opportunities. Here, the old human story appears again, but in a darker form. Our species became powerful because it could make maps inside the mind before moving through the world. Early people imagined the next valley, the next water source, the next shelter. Later states imagined harbours, markets, taxes, and labour systems across oceans. The same cognitive gift that once helped human beings survive could also help organised states expand at the expense of others. This is why the rise of Britain cannot be told as a clean tale of exploration or enterprise. It was also a story of unequal contact. Contracts could hide coercion. Trade could hide dependency. Profit could hide suffering. Goods that looked ordinary in British markets often carried long chains of labour, extraction, and displacement behind them. The empire was not built only by conquest after commerce had ended. Commerce itself could prepare conquest. A company might begin by asking for permission to trade, then request protection, then fortify its position, then intervene in local politics, then collect revenue, then govern. Each step could be explained as practical at the time, but together they changed the balance of power. The result was a form of expansion that looked flexible, because it did not always require immediate annexation. Britain could influence through a port, a treaty, a fleet, a creditor relationship, a company office, or a military alliance. This flexibility helped a relatively small island reach far beyond its own population and land. But it also spread responsibility across many hands, making harm easier to deny. The crown, investors, merchants, officers, sailors, clerks, and local collaborators could each claim they were only doing one limited thing. Yet together, those limited things formed a wider machine. The real story of how Britain became a global empire therefore passes through this quiet machinery of trade. Before the empire appeared as coloured land on maps, it existed as movement, ships crossing water, papers changing hands, goods entering warehouses, debts being recorded, and distant communities being drawn into systems they did not fully control. The army did not disappear from this story, but it was not always the first face of power. Sometimes the first face was a contract, and the shadow behind it was a cannon. The Atlantic changed the scale of Britain's story because it opened a wider world of wealth, settlement, violence, and loss. For a long time, England's overseas ambitions were smaller than those of Spain and Portugal, whose empires had already reached deeply into the Americas. But English merchants, sailors, investors, religious groups, and political leaders gradually entered the Atlantic world with growing force. They did not arrive in an empty space. They entered lands already inhabited by indigenous peoples with their own histories, languages, food systems, political relationships, and sacred places. They also entered an ocean already transformed by European rivalry, disease, conquest, forced labour, and exchange. The early English colonies in North America and the Caribbean were not all alike. Some struggled to survive. Some were shaped by religious settlement and farming. Others became tied to plantation production, especially in warmer regions where crops such as sugar and tobacco could be grown for distant markets. The plantation was not simply a farm. It was a system designed to turn land, labour, law, and violence into exportable wealth. This is where the story becomes darker, because Britain's growing Atlantic power depended not only on navigation and commerce, but on human suffering, organised as an economic structure. The deeper human beginning appears here in a painful contrast. Our species survived by caring for bodies, sharing food, raising children, and building small circles of trust around fragile life. Atlantic slavery turned that ancient human vulnerability into a target for profit. Bodies were captured, transported, sold, worked, punished, and counted as property. Families were broken, names and languages were pressured or erased. Labour was extracted not through mutual dependence, but through coercion backed by law and force. British wealth did not come only from plantations, and not every person in Britain profited equally, but the Atlantic economy became deeply connected to ports, ships, insurers, lenders, manufacturers, refiners and consumers. Sugar in a cup, tobacco in a pipe, cotton in a workshop, or a ship leaving a harbour could all be linked to distant systems of forced labour and colonial control. This made empire feel ordinary at home while making it brutal elsewhere. The Atlantic routes formed a web rather than a single road. Ships carried goods from Britain to Africa, enslaved Africans across the ocean, and plantation products back toward Europe, while many other routes and exchanges connected the same world in different ways. The pattern was not neat, but its moral centre is clear enough. People were made into commodities within a system that enriched others. Britain's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade grew over time, especially as its Atlantic colonies expanded, and as commercial institutions became more capable of supporting long-distance exploitation. Ports such as Liverpool, Bristol, and London became associated with this traffic and with the wider colonial economy around it. These places were not only local communities, they became nodes in an imperial system. A dockside decision could connect to a plantation field, a bank loan could connect to a ship's cargo, a fashionable taste could connect to pain carried across generations. The old human act of exchange, once a way to link groups through need and reciprocity, had been enlarged into something capable of hiding responsibility behind distance. That distance mattered. It allowed many people to consume the results of coercion without seeing the lash, the auction, the crowded ship, or the exhausted worker in the field. This is one reason the Atlantic was central to Britain's rise. It did not merely bring wealth. It trained the empire to separate comfort in one place from suffering in another. The story of Britain becoming a global empire therefore cannot be told only through naval skill or commercial courage. It must include the plantation world, indigenous dispossession, African enslavement, colonial law, and the way profit can travel farther than conscience when distance is organized by ships and protected by institutions over time. The Atlantic Empire was built through movement, but not all movement was free. Ships crossed the ocean carrying goods, instructions, tools, weapons, and people. Yet the most painful movement in this system was forced. Enslaved Africans were taken into a world where law, commerce, and violence worked together to deny their personhood while using their labor to create wealth. Britain's Atlantic expansion cannot be separated from this fact. The plantation economy needed land, but land alone did not produce sugar, tobacco, rice, cotton, or other export crops. It needed bodies under control. It needed workers who could be compelled to continue when exhaustion, illness, heat, grief, or fear would otherwise stop them. It needed overseers, punishments, patrols, laws, courts, ships, merchants, insurers, and buyers far away. In that sense, slavery was not an accident attached to empire. It became one of the systems through which imperial wealth was made. This does not mean every British fortune came from slavery, or that Britain's whole economy can be reduced to one cause. History is more complex than that. But it does mean that the Atlantic world gave Britain access to forms of profit built on coerced labour, and those profits helped shape ports, businesses, consumption, investment, and political interests. The deeper human beginning stands in sharp contrast here. Human beings evolved as social creatures whose survival depended on recognizing need in others, protecting children, sharing food, and building trust inside groups. Slavery turned social intelligence against human dignity. It used organization, memory, accounting, and law not to protect vulnerable bodies, but to manage them as property. A person could be listed in an inventory, priced in a market, insured as cargo, or forced into labor under rules written by people who benefited from the system. The violence was physical, but it was also administrative. It entered ledgers, contracts, inheritance records, shipping papers, and colonial statutes. That is why it could last for generations. Violence becomes more durable when it is made ordinary by paperwork and profit. Forced labor also shaped the land itself. Plantations changed forests, fields, rivers, and local food systems. They reorganized time around export crops and distant demand. The rhythm of work was not set by the needs of a family or a village, but by markets across the ocean. A person in Britain might desire sweetness, tobacco, or cloth without seeing the world of compulsion behind those goods. Distance softened the moral image. The product arrived refined, packaged, traded, and consumed, while the suffering stayed far from the table. This separation between comfort and cause became one of the quiet powers of empire. It allowed wealth to appear clean after it had travelled through dirty channels. In ports such as Liverpool, Bristol, and London, Atlantic commerce supported shipbuilding, warehousing, finance, refining, insurance, and related trades. Some people became directly involved in slave voyages. Others profited from plantation goods, credit, shipping services, or manufacturing that served colonial markets. The web was wide, and because it was wide, responsibility could feel scattered. One person lent money, another insured cargo, another sold goods, another bought sugar, another sat in Parliament defending colonial interests. Each action might look limited on its own, but together they sustained a system. Here again, the old human pattern of cooperation appears in a darker form. Cooperation is one of humanity's greatest strengths. It allowed small groups to survive cold nights, raise children, and remember landscapes across generations. But cooperation can also support harm when a society organizes itself around unequal value. In the Atlantic world, many institutions cooperated to protect the wealth of some people while stripping freedom from others. Resistance was always present. Enslaved people resisted through escape, rebellion, work slowdowns, cultural survival, family bonds, religious life, and the preservation of memory under extreme pressure. Abolitionist movements later grew in Britain and across the Atlantic, with black voices, formerly enslaved writers, religious campaigners, workers, and political activists all playing important roles. But abolition did not erase the wealth already accumulated, nor did it undo the generations of loss. The real story of Britain's empire must hold both facts together. Britain later became central to ending its own legal slave trade and slavery in many of its colonies. Yet it had already been deeply involved in the system it abolished. This is not a contradiction to hide. It is a historical truth to sit with carefully. Empire was not only expansion across maps. It was the power to decide whose labour counted, whose pain could be ignored, and whose future could be used to build comfort somewhere else. The cold truth of the Atlantic world is that part of Britain's later power was built from other people's loss. This does not mean every road, factory, bank or ship in Britain came from slavery, and it does not mean history can be reduced to one single cause. But it does mean that the growth of British wealth cannot be honestly separated from colonial extraction, indigenous dispossession, plantation labour, and the forced movement of African people across the ocean. Empire often hides its cost by spreading it out. One person sees a sweet drink. Another sees a profitable voyage. Another sees a growing port. Another sees a tax receipt, a warehouse, a mill, or an investment. Far away, another person feels the whip, the auction, the loss of land, the breaking of family, or the pressure of a law written without their consent. Distance allowed these realities to exist inside the same system without being felt equally. That was one of the strongest powers of empire. It could make suffering distant while making profit near. The deeper human beginning makes this especially painful to understand. Human life began in dependence. Every child needed protection. Everybody needed food, warmth, sleep, care, and belonging. Human communities survived because they learned to notice the needs of others and organize shared life around fragile bodies. The Atlantic Empire turned that ancient dependence into an unequal machine. Some bodies were protected by law, property, and profit. Other bodies were exposed to sale, punishment, hunger, forced labor, and removal. The same human skills that once helped people cooperate for survival, such as memory, planning, language, exchange, and trust, were used to build ships, contracts, markets, and plantation discipline. This is why the story must be told carefully. Britain's rise was not only a triumph of navigation, commerce, finance, and naval defence. It was also a history of moral separation, where wealth could be celebrated in one place while its human cost was buried in another. Colonial settlements in the Americas often depended on taking land from indigenous communities through war, treaty pressure, disease, settlement expansion, and legal systems that favoured European claims. These processes differed from region to region, and they cannot be described as one identical event, but the wider pattern was clear. Land that had already held human memory was reclassified by outsiders as property, plantation, colony, or frontier. Rivers, forests, hunting grounds, villages, and sacred places were pulled into imperial maps. The old human bond between people and landscape was broken or narrowed by force. For indigenous peoples, the loss was not only economic. It touched food systems, kinship, movement, spiritual life, and the ability of future generations to live in inherited places. For enslaved Africans and their descendants, the loss crossed the ocean with the body. It entered names, families, languages, labour, law, and memory. Britain's Atlantic wealth, therefore, came through more than goods. It came through the power to decide who could remain rooted and who could be uprooted. It came through the power to turn one person's land into another person's estate, and one person's labour into another person's profit. At home, the results could look like growth. Ports expanded, merchants gained influence, financial services matured. Consumer habits changed. Political interests formed around colonial trade. Some families accumulated wealth that outlasted the original violence behind it. At the same time, resistance never disappeared. Enslaved people resisted in daily and open ways. Indigenous communities defended land, rebuilt life, negotiated when forced, fought when possible, and carried memory across disruption. Abolitionists in Britain and across the Atlantic challenged the slave trade and slavery, and black voices were central to exposing the truth of the system. These movements mattered deeply, but they should not be used to wash away what came before. Ending a wrong does not erase the wealth gathered while the wrong was legal. This is one reason the real story of Britain becoming a global empire cannot be only a story of ships reaching farther and markets growing wider. It must also be a story of what was removed from others so that Britain could gain reach. A small island learned to use the sea as a road, but the road did not carry only sailors and goods. It carried grief, coercion, survival, resistance, and memory. The empire's power grew because distance was organized. Its moral problem grew. For the same reason, the farther profit could travel from pain, the easier it became for a society to mistake expansion for success alone. Britain's rise did not happen in an empty ocean. Every route it entered was already shaped by rivals, older empires, trading peoples, local rulers, and long histories that Britain did not control. Spain and Portugal had moved earlier into Atlantic and overseas empire. The Dutch built a powerful commercial and maritime system with remarkable skill in shipping, finance, and trade. France remained a major land and sea rival, with its own colonial ambitions in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and India. England, and later Britain, had to grow inside this crowded world. Its empire was not born from peaceful expansion into open space. It was formed through competition, imitation, opportunism, war, and negotiation. This matters because the real story is not that Britain simply discovered a path to power. It learned by watching others, copying useful methods, challenging rivals where it could, and choosing the sea as the place where a smaller island might compete with larger continental powers. The ocean became a wide arena where ships, goods, guns, maps, credit, and alliances all moved together. Spain's early Atlantic wealth, especially from the Americas, showed how overseas resources could change European politics. Dutch success showed how finance, trade, shipbuilding, and disciplined commercial organization could create influence beyond the size of a homeland. French power showed that empire could be tied to both continental strength and overseas ambition. Britain's later advantage grew partly from having to face all of these examples. It did not invent the age of empire, but it became unusually skilled at surviving within it. The deeper human beginning can be felt beneath this rivalry. Human beings have always learned by observing other groups. A tool, a route, a crop, a story, or a method of defense could spread because one community saw that another had found something useful. In the early modern oceanic world, states behaved in a similar way but with far greater consequences. They watched one another's ships, ports, colonies, and profits. They measured weakness. They remembered defeats. They adapted. Competition became a harsh teacher. England's rivalry with Spain carried religious, political, and commercial dimensions. Protestant England and Catholic Spain stood on opposite sides of major conflicts in Europe, and the Atlantic made that rivalry wider. English privateers, backed or tolerated at different times by the Crown, attacked Spanish shipping and challenged Iberian dominance. These actions were not simply adventurous voyages. They were part of a world where violence and commerce often blended together. A captured cargo could enrich investors, weaken a rival, and feed the belief that sea power could change national destiny. The Dutch, meanwhile, were rivals of a different kind. Their maritime economy was efficient, urban, commercial, and deeply connected to European and overseas trade. Conflict with the Dutch pushed England to think more carefully about shipping, naval strength, trade regulation, and the protection of its own merchants. The Navigation Acts, passed in the 17th century, reflected this desire to channel commerce through English ships and ports. Such policies were not abstract economic theories for ordinary people. They affected sailors, dock workers, merchants, colonial producers, and consumers. They tried to turn the movement of goods into national advantage. Once again, the old human need to secure resources appeared at a larger scale. Early communities guarded hunting grounds, water sources, and stored food. States guarded trade routes, harbours, and markets. The objects changed, but the underlying pressure remained. Survival and power depended on controlling access to what was needed. France became Britain's most enduring rival in many later struggles. French strength on land forced Britain to think carefully about alliances in Europe, while French colonial ambitions forced Britain to compete overseas. North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India all became places where European rivalry intersected with local societies that had their own aims and conflicts. Britain's expansion cannot be understood without remembering that local alliances mattered. Indigenous nations, African polities, Indian rulers, merchants, soldiers, and communities were not passive scenery. They made choices under pressure, negotiated, resisted, allied, and adapted. European empires often depended on these local relationships, even when they later pretended that victory belonged to Europe alone. The sea wars and colonial contests of this period trained Britain in a difficult lesson. Controlling one place was useful, but controlling routes between places could be even more powerful. A sugar island, a fishing ground, a trading fort, a naval base, or a river mouth could matter because it connected movement. Britain's future empire would grow through these connections. It learned that wealth did not sit still. It moved through water, labour, credit, and violence. And in a world of Spanish, Dutch, and French competition, Britain became more than an island defending its coast. It became a rival trying to turn movement itself into power. The struggle that later became known as the 7 Years' War was one of the great turning points in Britain's rise, not because it began the empire from nothing, but because it showed how far British power had learned to travel. Fighting spread across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India, linking places that had once seemed separate into one connected contest. Britain did not fight alone, and it did not win everywhere with ease. The war was costly, uncertain, and dependent on allies, money, ships, soldiers, merchants, colonial settlers, and local partners in many regions. Yet its outcome changed the balance of global power. Britain emerged with a stronger position in North America, greater influence in India, and a wider sense that naval force, finance, and overseas strategy could work together on a scale larger than earlier generations had imagined. This is why the war matters so deeply to the real story of how Britain became a global empire. It revealed that empire was no longer only a collection of voyages, colonies, companies, and trading posts. It was becoming a system in which distant conflicts could affect one another. A battle in North America could matter to diplomacy in Europe. A naval blockade could shape events in the Caribbean. A trading company's war in India could become tied to the wider rivalry between Britain and France. The world was being drawn into a tighter web, and Britain was learning how to pull on several strands at once. The deeper human beginning is visible beneath the scale. Human beings first survived by connecting places in memory, a water source here, a shelter there, a dangerous crossing, a seasonal food supply, a neighbouring group that might help or harm. Power grew when people could remember links between scattered points. In the 18th century, Britain was doing something similar through institutions rather than only memory. Maps, letters, credit, naval orders, shipping routes, forts, and commercial intelligence allowed distant places to be held inside one political imagination. The human mind had always made maps before the body moved. Now the state, the navy, and merchant finance were making maps before fleets and armies moved. The war with France sharpened this ability. France was powerful on land and active overseas, which meant Britain had to avoid thinking in only one theatre. It used subsidies and alliances in Europe while relying heavily on naval strength and colonial campaigns abroad. The Royal Navy helped protect trade, disrupt enemy movement, and connect British operations across oceans. Money was equally important. Britain's financial system allowed the state to borrow large sums, spreading the cost of war into the future. This did not make the burden disappear. Taxes, debt, and military spending pressed heavily on society and would later create political problems, especially in relation to the American colonies. But during the war, financial capacity gave Britain endurance. It could keep fighting across distance because it could turn future revenue into present force. That ability became one of the quiet engines of empire. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 confirmed major British gains, including Canada from France and Florida from Spain. While France's position in India was limited compared with Britain's expanding influence through the East India Company, these outcomes did not mean Britain had solved the problem of empire. In fact, victory created new problems. Larger territories required defense. Settlers had expectations. Indigenous nations in North America faced new pressures as British authority expanded into spaces already shaped by their own sovereignty and diplomacy. In India, company power grew in ways that would bring revenue, war, famine, administrative experiments, and moral controversy. The war gave Britain reach, but reach brought responsibility, cost, and conflict. Here again, the older human pattern returns. A group that gains more territory does not simply gain more safety. It gains more borders to defend, more relationships to manage, more food to move, more promises to keep, and more enemies who may resist. Expansion can look like strength from far away, while inside it may create new forms of strain. Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War was therefore both triumph and warning. It showed that a small island could organize ships, credit, alliances, and overseas force into global power. But it also showed that global power never rests on victory alone. It rests on systems that must be fed constantly with money, labour, obedience, and violence. After this war, Britain was no longer only one empire among several. It had become the leading maritime and colonial power of its age, and the question was no longer whether it could reach distant worlds. The question was what that reach would do to everyone held inside it. After the 7 Years' War, Britain's strength rested less on owning one continuous piece of land than on holding key points in a moving world. This was one of the most important differences between a land empire and a maritime empire. A land empire often seeks depth. Rivers, roads, fields, towns, borders, and populations joined together across neighbouring territory. Britain's empire often worked through connection. A harbour could matter more than a vast inland region if that harbour controlled the passage of ships. An island could matter because it fed a fleet, repaired vessels, stored supplies, or watched a route. A narrow strait, a river mouth, a coaling station, or a fortified port could become valuable far beyond its size. This way of thinking changed the meaning of power. Britain did not need to stand everywhere at once. It needed to appear at the points where movement could be protected, taxed, interrupted, or redirected. The sea made this possible because the sea joined distant places without requiring continuous territory between them. A ship leaving one port could cross open water and arrive at another point of control weeks or months later. Between those points there might be no British land at all, yet British influence could still travel with the vessel, the flag, the cannon, the contract, and the credit behind it. The deeper human beginning appears again in this attention to roots. Early human beings survived by knowing not only places, but connections between places. A water source was useful because a path led to it. A shelter mattered because people could return to it. A hunting ground had value because memory linked it to seasons and movement. In the same basic way, Britain's maritime empire grew by remembering and organizing pathways. The scale was larger, the tools were more complex, and the consequences were far more unequal. But the underlying logic was old. Life and power depend on how one place reaches another. After major victories over France, Britain gained confidence that sea lanes could be more decisive than single battles on land. The Royal Navy became central to this system. It protected trade, escorted convoys, blockaded rivals, moved troops, and connected distant possessions. Naval bases allowed ships to operate farther from home. Merchant networks provided information and economic reason for protection. Finance allowed wars and fleets to be sustained beyond the immediate wealth available in the treasury. Together, these elements made distance less frightening for Britain than for many earlier states. Distance still killed sailors, delayed orders, ruined cargoes, and complicated command, but it could be managed. That was the key. Empire was not only the conquest of space, it was the management of distance. Control over routes also meant control over timing. A rival fleet delayed in one ocean might fail to support a colony in another. A merchant convoy protected at the right moment could preserve fortunes. A blockade could turn hunger, fear, and shortage into weapons without occupying every field. This was a colder kind of power, often less visible than a battle, but deeply effective. It turned geography into pressure. It allowed Britain to influence events by deciding what could move, when it could move, and under whose protection. The ordinary human body remained inside this machinery. Sailors endured long voyages, poor conditions, disease, discipline, storms, and separation from home. Soldiers were carried to climates and wars they barely understood. Dock workers, rope makers, carpenters, clerks, cooks, gunners, and navigators made the system possible through repeated labour. On the other side of imperial routes, colonised peoples faced demands shaped by decisions made far away. A port that looked strategic on a British map could be a lived homeland, a market town, a sacred coast, or a place where local communities had their own histories long before imperial planners named it useful. Route-based power had a special danger. It could make places seem important only because of what passed through them. Human worlds were reduced to stations, choke points, resources, and access. Britain's empire expanded through that reduction. It learned to value Gibraltar, Caribbean islands, Indian Ocean ports, Atlantic crossings, and later other strategic points because each one strengthened a chain. The chain did not have to be continuous on land. It only had to hold across water. This is why the real story of Britain's rise is not simply that it conquered many territories. It is that it learned to arrange scattered places into a working system. A single colony might be profitable, but a connected network could defend profit, move force, and shape the choices of rivals. The empire became powerful because it understood that the world was not only made of lands, it was made of passages between lands. Britain's greatest advantage came when it learned how to stand at those passages and make movement answer to its own interests. India became central to Britain's empire through a path that began with trade, not direct royal rule. The East India Company was created at the end of the 16th century to seek profit in the rich markets of Asia. It entered a world that was already deeply commercial, politically complex, and culturally sophisticated. India was not waiting to be discovered, and it was not an empty prize. It held powerful states, old cities, skilled textile producers, merchants, bankers, farmers, soldiers, ports, courts, religious communities, and long-distance trading networks that connected the Indian Ocean to the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Europe. The company first came as one more foreign commercial actor in a crowded world. Its early servants wanted spices, textiles, dyes, tea, and other goods that could be sold for profit. They depended on permission, negotiation, local brokers, Indian merchants, and political conditions they did not control. This beginning matters because it shows how empire can enter quietly. It does not always begin with a kingdom openly declaring that it will rule millions of people. Sometimes it begins with warehouses, trading rights, coastal settlements, gifts, letters, and careful attention to local power. The deeper human beginning is visible beneath the surface. Human beings have always exchanged things across distance because no single place contains everything a community needs or desires. Early people moved stone, shells, salt, food, pigments, and stories through networks of trust and need. Trade widened the human world before states became large. But when trade is joined to armed ships, monopoly rights, private armies, and distant investors, the old human act of exchange can become something much harder. The East India Company was not simply a group of merchants buying and selling. Over time, it became a corporation with political privileges, military capacity, and growing ambition. It could sign agreements, fortify settlements, employ soldiers, and call upon the British state when its interests were threatened. Its trading posts at places such as Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta were not all the same, but together they formed a pattern of presence along the edges of a vast subcontinent. At first, the company's survival depended on fitting itself into existing Indian systems. It had to bargain with rulers, use Indian credit networks, rely on Indian labour, and learn from local commercial knowledge. Its power was limited by the strength of surrounding states, especially the Mughal Empire and regional authorities, but the political landscape changed over time. The Mughal Empire weakened in stages, regional powers expanded, European rivals competed, and warfare opened new opportunities. The company learned to use these conditions. It made alliances, intervened in succession disputes, hired Indian soldiers known as sepoys, and turned commercial protection into military involvement. The shift from trade to rule was not one clean moment, but the Battle of Plassey in 1757 is widely recognized as a major turning point. After victory in Bengal, company influence grew sharply, especially as it gained access to revenue and political authority. Revenue changed everything. A merchant who controls trade seeks profit from goods. A ruler who controls revenue can draw wealth from land, harvests, people, and law. Once the company began collecting revenue in Bengal after the grant of Diwani rights in 1765, It was no longer only buying from India. It was extracting from Indian society to finance its own power. Here the old human link to land returns in a darker form. Since farming began, land has carried food, memory, family, debt, and survival. To control revenue from land is to touch the daily life of cultivators, landlords, officials, and households. Company rule reached into this fragile chain. Its decisions affected taxation, agriculture, trade, famine vulnerability, and local authority, though outcomes differed across regions and periods. Britain's empire in India, therefore, did not begin as a simple conquest by the British Crown. It grew through a company that turned trade into leverage, leverage into military power, and military power into administration. The real story is not that Britain suddenly overpowered India by destiny or superiority. It is that a commercial corporation found ways to use political fragmentation, financial systems, local alliances, armed force, and imperial backing to move from the edge of trade into the centre of rule. After the East India Company gained stronger influence in Bengal, its problem changed. It was no longer only trying to buy goods cheaply and sell them profitably. It had to govern, collect revenue, keep armies supplied, manage officials, answer investors, and protect itself from rivals. This was a strange and unstable form of power. A company built for trade had begun to act like a state, but it was still driven by commercial expectation. Its servants were often far from Britain, operating in political worlds they understood only incompletely, while local rulers, bankers, landholders, soldiers, merchants, and farmers all responded in ways shaped by their own interests and pressures. British power in India grew through this mixture. It did not come only from direct force, and it did not come only from Indian weakness. It came from alliances, debts, military recruitment, diplomatic pressure, legal claims, and the ability to turn revenue into more soldiers, more influence, and more administrative reach. The deeper human beginning is visible here because every large system of power rests on simple human needs. Armies need food. Officials need pay. Farmers need enough grain to survive the year. Families need land, water, animals, tools, and time. When a distant company entered the revenue structure of Indian society, it touched these basic needs. Taxation was not an idea floating above life. It reached into harvests, debts, rents, and household security. In Bengal and later in other regions, company policies were filtered through existing systems and local intermediaries, which made rule complex and uneven. Some Indian elites cooperated because cooperation protected status or opened advantage. Some resisted because company power threatened older rights or new ambitions. Many ordinary people had little control over the higher struggles that reshaped their obligations. War expanded the company's role further. It fought Indian powers, European rivals, and shifting coalitions, often relying heavily on Indian soldiers in its armies. Sepoys were essential to company power, and their presence shows why the story cannot be told as a simple contest between Britain and India. The machinery of empire often worked by drawing local people into its own structure. Soldiers fought for pay, survival, loyalty, coercion, opportunity, or obligation, and their reasons could differ greatly. Indian bankers and merchants also mattered, because war and administration required credit. Local knowledge mattered, because foreign officials could not govern without translators, scribes, revenue experts, guides, and informants. The company's strength came partly from its ability to attach itself to existing Indian networks, then redirect those networks toward its own survival and expansion. This is one of the quieter truths of empire. Domination often depends on cooperation under unequal conditions. It does not erase local agency, but it changes the price of every choice. Administration followed conquest because revenue had to be made regular. Offices, courts, surveys, regulations, and written procedures expanded. The company tried to classify land rights, standardize payments, supervise officials, and reduce uncertainty, though these efforts often produced new tensions. British administrators sometimes described their work as order, reform, or improvement, but the lived effects were mixed and contested. In some places, new arrangements benefited certain landholders or commercial groups. In others, they increased pressure on cultivators, disrupted older balances, or intensified extraction. The body remained at the center. A policy written in a distant office could become hunger in a village, profit in a city, debt in a household, or promotion for an official. The old human link between land and survival was being translated into paperwork, revenue targets, and legal categories. Over time, the British state became more involved in supervising the company, especially as scandal, war, corruption, and territorial responsibility became harder to ignore. The company's rule raised uncomfortable questions in Britain itself. Could a corporation govern vast populations? Could profit be separated from justice? Could distant violence be controlled by officials at home who depended on the wealth it produced? These questions did not stop expansion, but they exposed the moral instability of company empire. India became not merely a market, but a source of revenue, manpower, prestige, and strategic position. Britain's global power grew because the company learned to turn local alliances, military force, taxation, and administration into a durable system. Yet that system rested on millions of lives whose needs were older than empire itself. Food, shelter, family, memory, and the right to remain more than a line in someone else's account. India became the largest and most important centre of British imperial power, not because it was a simple possession, but because it connected almost every major force that made empire work. It offered revenue, soldiers, markets, prestige, raw materials, strategic position, and a vast field of administration. For Britain, India was never only one colony among others. It became a central pillar in the imperial system, a place whose wealth and importance helped support British ambitions far beyond South Asia. Yet that centrality was built through pressure on Indian society itself. The East India Company's rule expanded across regions with different languages, religions, political traditions, economies, and local histories. No single description can capture the whole subcontinent. Bengal, Madras, Bombay, the princely states, the northern plains, the Deccan, Punjab, and many other regions were drawn into British power in different ways and at different speeds. Some areas were ruled directly. Others remained under Indian rulers who accepted treaties, limits, and British influence. This uneven structure became one of the empire's defining habits. It did not always need to erase every local ruler. It could surround, supervise, pressure, and redirect existing authority. The deeper human beginning remains visible beneath this vast machinery. Human beings first formed larger communities because food, safety, memory, and care could not be secured by isolated bodies alone. Villages, kin groups, and later states grew from the need to organize life across time. In India, British imperial rule entered those older systems and altered them through revenue demands, courts, armies, railways, schools, trade policies, and legal categories. A decision made in a company office or later in a government department could travel into a village as a tax obligation, a land dispute, a crop choice, a wage, a railway journey, or a soldier's enlistment. The empire became powerful because it made distance administrative. It learned to turn a faraway land into reports, maps, accounts, regulations, and commands. But India was not passive within this process. Indian merchants, bankers, soldiers, peasants, rulers, scholars, workers, clerks, religious leaders, and reformers all shaped the world that empire tried to control. Some cooperated, some resisted, some adapted, and many made choices under constraints they did not create. The uprising of 1857 revealed how unstable company rule had become and how deeply military, religious, political, and economic tensions could combine. After the rebellion was suppressed, authority passed from the East India Company to the British Crown in 1858. This change did not remove empire, it reorganized it. British rule became more formal, more cautious in some areas, and more deeply tied to the image of imperial responsibility. At the same time, the structure of power remained unequal. Britain claimed to bring order, law, and improvement, but those claims existed beside extraction, racial hierarchy, coercion, and the repeated subordination of Indian interests to imperial needs. India's importance also reached outward. Indian revenues and resources helped support imperial administration. Indian soldiers served in British campaigns in different parts of the empire. Indian ports connected the Indian Ocean to wider British strategy. The route to India shaped British interest in Egypt, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and later the Suez Canal. A map of empire could appear scattered, but India gave many of its lines a common direction. The old island story returned at a larger scale. Britain had once learned to survive by looking beyond its shores. Now it depended on holding connections between oceans, ports, and territories so that India could remain tied to London. This shows how far the original problem of distance had changed. For early human beings, distance meant the walk to water, shelter, food, or safety. For an empire, distance meant communication, command, shipping, military movement, and the control of people who might never see the capital that claimed authority over them. India made Britain powerful because it gave the empire depth beyond the island's own land and population. But it also made the moral question larger. To govern such a vast society from afar required more than confidence. It required categories that simplified human life, systems that extracted wealth, and beliefs that justified inequality. The real story of Britain's global empire cannot pass through India as if it were only a source of British strength. It was also a place of Indian labour, Indian thought, Indian resistance, Indian adaptation, and Indian memory, all held inside a system that Britain could never fully understand, even while it tried to rule it. The Industrial Revolution changed Britain's empire because it changed what Britain needed from the world and what Britain could send back into it. Earlier imperial power had depended on ships, ports, credit, chartered companies, plantations, and war. Those forces remained important, but from the late 18th century onward, Britain also became a place where production itself began to move at a new speed. Coal, iron, steam engines, textile machinery, canals, factories, and later railways altered the relationship between labour, time, distance, and wealth. Britain did not industrialise because of one simple cause. It had accessible coal in important regions, growing commercial networks, capital from trade and agriculture, skilled craftspeople, scientific and technical curiosity, property and legal systems that supported investment, and markets at home and overseas. None of these alone explains everything, but together they helped create conditions in which machines could be built, improved, financed, and used repeatedly. The change was not only mechanical, it was bodily. For most of human history, work had been limited by muscle, animal strength, wind, water, and daylight. A person could spin, weave, carry, dig, hammer, or walk only within the endurance of flesh. Animals could pull more, rivers could turn mills, and sails could catch wind, but energy remained tied closely to natural rhythms. Industrial Britain learned to burn ancient sunlight stored underground as coal and turn it into heat, motion, pressure, and speed. This was one of the great transformations in the human story. Power no longer had to come mainly from living bodies or moving water. It could come from fossil fuel, extracted from the earth and fed into machines. The deeper human beginning is important here because our species began with small bodies in large environments, always trying to save effort, carry more, move farther, and survive uncertainty. A stone tool extended the hand. A basket extended the arms. A fire extended warmth into the night. A steam engine extended work beyond the limits of muscle. Industrialization was not separate from the old human struggle against limitation. It was a vast enlargement of it. But enlargement brought new demands. Factories needed raw materials. Textile mills needed cotton. Ironworks needed ore and coal. Expanding cities needed food. Ships needed cargo. Workers needed wages, however harsh and unequal those wages could be. Overseas markets became more important because machines could produce goods in quantities that had to be sold somewhere. Empire offered both supply and demand. It could provide raw materials from distant lands and consumers for manufactured goods. This did not mean industry simply caused empire, or empire simply caused industry. The relationship ran in both directions. Imperial trade helped feed industrial growth, while industrial capacity strengthened imperial reach. Cotton is a clear example. British textile production depended heavily on cotton grown abroad, much of it tied for a long time to enslaved labour in the Americas. especially before the abolition of slavery in the British Empire and before later shifts in supply. The clean cloth in a shop could carry hidden histories of land, labour, coercion and global exchange. A machine in Lancashire was connected to fields across the ocean, to merchants in ports, to ships at sea, and to consumers in many regions. Industrial power made these connections faster and more intense. It also changed transportation inside Britain. Canals helped move heavy goods more cheaply. Improved roads and later railways connected coalfields, factories, ports and cities. A mine in one region could feed a furnace elsewhere. A mill town could send cloth toward a port. A port could connect that cloth to Africa, India, the Caribbean or other markets. The old island problem of distance was being solved in a new way, not only by ships but by inland networks that made the island itself more tightly connected. This again reaches back to the earliest human need to link places: a safe path to water, a known pass through hills, a seasonal route for food, all mattered because survival depended on connections. Industrial Britain built a denser version of that ancient map. Canals, roads, warehouses, docks, rail lines, factories, and mines joined into one moving system. The cost was heavy. Workers faced long hours, dangerous conditions, polluted air, crowded housing and unstable wages. Landscapes changed under smoke, pits and industrial waste. Empire and industry together could make wealth appear as progress, while hiding the people and environments worn down to create it. Britain's global power grew stronger because machines increased output, transport improved movement, and imperial networks widened access to materials and markets. But the true story is not simply that Britain became richer through invention. It is that invention gave an island state a new appetite for the world and a new capacity to bind distant labour, distant land, and distant consumers into the rhythm of its machines. Steamships, railways, and the electric telegraph changed the British Empire because they changed the meaning of distance. Earlier empires had always struggled with delay. A command sent across an ocean might take months to arrive. A governor far from home could act before London knew what had happened. A rebellion could grow, a famine could worsen, a market could shift, or a rival fleet could move while messages were still at sea. Distance gave local officials freedom, but it also created uncertainty. Industrial technology did not remove distance from the world, but it made distance more manageable. Steamships no longer depended on wind in the same old way. They could move with greater regularity, especially once coal stations, dockyards and repair networks supported them. Railways carried soldiers, officials, raw materials, passengers and goods across land faster than carts, pack animals or river routes could usually manage. Telegraph cables carried information with a speed that earlier generations would have found almost impossible to imagine. Together, these technologies made empire feel closer to its own centre. A decision in London could reach a distant colony more quickly. A crisis could be reported sooner. A market price could influence trade across oceans. A military order could connect ships, ports, and inland forces in a tighter rhythm. The deeper human beginning is still visible here. Human beings began with bodies that moved slowly, voices that carried only a short distance, and memories that had to hold roots through uncertain landscapes. A path to water, a smoke signal, a drumbeat, a shouted warning, or a messenger on foot all extended human reach a little farther. Industrial Britain enlarged that ancient desire to send bodies, goods and messages beyond immediate presence. A railway extended the footstep. A steamship extended the coastal path. A telegraph extended the voice. Empire became stronger when these extensions were tied to government, commerce and military force. But the system depended on more than machines. Steamships needed coal, and coal needed miners, ports, storage depots and global supply points. Railways needed iron, steel, capital, engineers, surveyors, labourers, land, and political permission. Telegraph lines needed cables, stations, operators, maintenance, and secure routes. Every new speed rested on slow human work. Men dug, carried, hammered, laid track, loaded coal, repaired engines, kept accounts, and endured danger. In colonised regions, these systems often brought new kinds of pressure. Railways could move crops to ports, soldiers to troubled districts, and raw materials toward imperial markets. Telegraphs could help officials respond faster, but they could also tighten surveillance and control. Steamships could carry migrants, troops, mail, and manufactured goods, but they also deepened the demand for strategic ports and coaling stations. Technology did not make empire harmless. It made empire more coordinated. India shows this clearly. Railways were presented by British authorities as signs of improvement and connection, and they did create new movement for people, goods, and information. But they also served imperial needs, linking production zones, ports, military centres, and administrative spaces. The route to India became one of the great strategic concerns of the empire, especially after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, which shortened the sea journey between Europe and the Indian Ocean. Control over Egypt, the Red Sea, and nearby routes became more important because India had become central to British power. Here the old island story returned in a sharper form. Britain had once learned to use the sea to survive at the edge of Europe. Now it needed a chain of sea lanes, ports, cables, ships, and bases to hold together a world system. The human origin of this chain lies in a simple need: to stay connected when separation threatens survival. Early families and communities needed to know where others were, where food could be found, and when danger was near. Empires turned that need into administration. The telegraph made this transformation especially clear. A message no longer had to travel only as fast as a horse, a ship, or a walking human body. Information could cross great distances in minutes or hours where cables existed. This changed politics, journalism, finance, and military command. It also changed the imagination of rule. Distant territories could seem more present to the imperial centre, even though the people living there remained socially and morally distant. That was one of the dangers of technological empire. It could make control faster without making understanding deeper. A report could reduce a village, a strike, a crop failure, or a conflict into a few lines of official language. A railway map could make land look like a network of useful routes while hiding the homes, fields, graves, and local meanings beneath the tracks. Britain's global power grew because steam, rail, and telegraph helped it move faster than before. Yet speed did not solve the moral problem of empire. It only allowed decisions made far away to arrive sooner, and allowed the consequences of those decisions to spread with greater force. Britain's industrial empire did not operate only by taking territory and placing it under a flag. It worked by connecting different places into one moving system, where raw materials, manufactured goods, soldiers, officials, messages, credit, and law could travel in repeated patterns. A colony might grow cotton, another might supply sugar, another might offer a naval base, another might receive British textiles, another might provide soldiers, and another might stand near a route that mattered to India or the Atlantic. From far away, these places looked separate on a map. Inside the imperial system, they were linked by ships, cables, banks, insurance houses, military planning, and political decisions made across distance. This is why industrial Britain became more than a country with colonies. It became the centre of a network that tried to make the world move through British channels. The power lay not only in ownership but in connection. A port was useful because it opened a route. A railway was useful because it carried crops, troops, minerals, or passengers toward ports and cities. A telegraph was useful because it made decisions travel faster. A factory was useful because it turned imported material into goods that could be sold back into global markets. The deeper human beginning remains visible beneath this vast machine. Human beings first survived by linking places in memory, where water could be found, where shelter was safe, where animals moved, where danger had appeared before. A landscape became livable when people understood its connections. Industrial empire enlarged that ancient habit into a global structure. Britain learned to see distant lands not only as places with people, histories, and meanings, but as nodes in a system of movement. That way of seeing gave Britain power, but it also narrowed moral vision. A place could be valued because it produced a crop, held a harbour, carried a railway, or lay near a strategic route, while the lives already rooted there became secondary in imperial planning. Industry made this reduction stronger because machines demanded steady supply. A mill could not run on vague ambition. It needed cotton, fuel, labour, transport, markets, and money. A railway could not exist as an idea. It needed land, steel, workers, capital, and political force. An empire that served industry had to make movement regular. Irregular local rhythms, subsistence needs, customary land rights, and older forms of production often stood in the way of that regularity. So the empire classified, measured, redirected, and pressured. It turned forests into timber reserves, fields into export zones, harbours into imperial gateways, and people into labour forces, taxpayers, soldiers, or consumers. Sometimes British officials described these changes as order, development, or improvement. Sometimes new infrastructure did create real movement and new possibilities, but those gains were never separate from the unequal system that shaped them. A railway could help a traveller reach a city, and the same railway could help extract crops during a crisis. A telegraph could send news quickly, and the same wire could help suppress resistance. A port could connect merchants, and the same port could drain wealth outward. The older human story returns here through the body. Every network rests on bodies that carry weight, endure heat, breathe dust, dig coal, load ships, lay track, harvest crops, and stand under authority. Industrial empire often spoke in the language of progress, but progress was not felt equally. For some in Britain, it meant cheaper goods, expanding cities, wages, investment, and national confidence. For many in colonised societies, it could mean land pressure, tax burdens, labour demands, racial hierarchy, and exposure to distant market forces they did not control. The system was powerful because it joined unequal experiences into one flow. Comfort in one place could depend on strain in another. Speed in one place could depend on slow exhaustion somewhere else. This is the quiet structure behind Britain's global reach. It did not simply spread outward like water from an island. It gathered the world into circuits. Cotton moved to mills, cloth moved to markets, soldiers moved to campaigns, telegraphs moved orders, ships moved coal, mail, officials, migrants, and manufactured goods. Banks moved credit, laws moved claims of ownership and authority. The empire became a vast arrangement for making distant things usable to a central power, yet the more connected it became, the more fragile it also became. A disruption in one region could affect prices in another. A war could threaten sea lanes. A rebellion could interrupt revenue. A famine could expose the cruelty of policies shaped by distance. A financial panic could travel faster than goods. Connection created strength, but it also created dependence. Britain's industrial empire was therefore not only an empire of flags, maps, and formal rule. It was an empire of motion, built from the attempt to make land, labour, machines, oceans, and time answer to one organised rhythm. At the height of its power, Britain often described its empire through the language of order. It spoke of law, administration, roads, railways, schools, courts, ports, sanitation, maps, and stable government. This language mattered because empire never survives by force alone. It also needs a story about itself. Britain wanted to present its rule as organised, rational, and useful, especially when compared with what it described as disorder, weakness, or backwardness in the societies it controlled. Some institutions built under British rule did leave lasting structures: legal codes, civil services, universities, railways, postal systems, ports, and administrative boundaries. These things were real, and they shaped many countries long after formal empire ended, but they cannot be understood honestly if they are separated from the unequal power that produced them. A court may speak the language of justice, while still serving an imperial hierarchy. A railway may carry ordinary passengers, while also moving troops, raw materials, and export crops. A school may teach literacy, while also training a small class to serve a foreign administration. Infrastructure can improve movement and still deepen control. Law can reduce some forms of local violence and still protect an unjust system. The deeper human beginning is visible beneath this contradiction. Human beings first built rules because life in groups required predictability. People needed ways to settle disputes, share food, protect children, mark belonging, and remember obligations. A rule can make life safer when it grows from mutual need. But a rule can also become a chain when it is imposed by one group over another. British imperial law often carried both faces. It could create procedures, records, contracts, and courts that made daily life more predictable in some ways. At the same time, it helped define who had authority, who owned land, who paid taxes, who could move freely, who could speak in court, and whose customs would be recognized or ignored. The empire's image of order rested on this power to name and classify. People became subjects, laborers, landholders, tribes, castes, natives, migrants, taxpayers, or defendants inside systems that often simplified complex societies for administrative use. Education played a similar role. British officials and missionaries did not all think alike, and education developed differently across regions. Some schools opened doors to literacy, professions, political thought, and later anti-colonial leadership. Many future critics of empire used the language, law, and political ideas learned under colonial systems to challenge colonial rule itself. Yet education under empire was not neutral. It often carried assumptions about British superiority, European history, Christian morality, or the supposed need for colonial guidance. It could teach people to read, while also teaching them where empire believed they belonged. This is one of the quieter ironies of imperial power. A system can create tools that later help people resist it. A school built for administration can produce minds that question the right of foreigners to govern. A legal system designed to stabilize rule can provide vocabulary for rights, petitions, and national movements. The same institution can serve control in one generation and resistance in another. Infrastructure also reveals the double nature of empire. Roads, railways, telegraphs, canals, and ports connected territories more tightly than before. They changed travel, trade, communication, and administration. In many places, people used these networks for their own purposes, carrying goods, visiting family, seeking work, sharing news, and building political movements. But the original priorities often came from imperial needs: moving soldiers, extracting resources, connecting plantations or mines to ports, protecting strategic routes, and making distant territories more legible to the center. The old human need to connect places was enlarged again, but not equally. Early communities made paths because they needed water, food, shelter, and contact. Empire made networks because it needed revenue, control, labor, and speed. The difference lies in who chose the route and who paid the cost. Britain's story about itself emphasized improvement, but improvement under unequal rule always carried a question. Improvement for whom? And under whose authority? The empire could point to bridges, courts, schools, and railways. Colonized people could point to taxes, racial hierarchy, land loss, coercion, and the way local priorities were often placed beneath imperial interests. Both the visible structure and the hidden pressure belong to the same history. To tell only one side is to make the past too simple. The real story of Britain's global empire must notice how power dressed itself in the language of order, and how that order often depended on people who were never allowed to shape it as equals. The empire's promise of order always stood beside realities that were harder to place in official language. Britain could speak of law, roads, schools, and administration, but many colonized people experienced the same system through land pressure, racial hierarchy, forced labor, heavy taxation, police power, censorship, military punishment, and hunger sharpened by policies made far away. Exploitation did not always look like open theft. Sometimes it looked like a tax demand that forced a farmer into cash crops. Sometimes it looked like a mine contract, a plantation rule, a railway built toward a port instead of toward local needs, or a court that recognized one kind of property while weakening another. The empire often worked by changing the conditions under which people could live. It did not have to take everything at once. It could redirect labor, reshape markets, define legal status, and make older ways of survival harder to maintain. This is why the story of British power must remain close to the human body. Before empires, before written law, before states, human life depended on food, shelter, land, kinship, water, rest, and the ability to pass safety to children. Colonial rule touched these basic things. When land was enclosed, taxed, surveyed, or converted toward export, the effect was not only economic. It entered kitchens, fields, marriages, debts, migrations, and graves. A policy could be written calmly in an office and still become exhaustion in a village. A price change in a global market could decide whether a household ate well or went without. Racial hierarchy gave this inequality a language. British imperial rule often placed Europeans above colonized peoples in law, custom, employment, housing, education, and everyday respect. The exact forms differed across regions, but the pattern was widely present. Whiteness and British identity were treated as signs of authority, while local knowledge was often dismissed unless it served imperial use. This hierarchy allowed ordinary injustice to appear normal. It made unequal pay easier to defend, political exclusion easier to justify, and violence easier to excuse. It also shaped how information travelled back to Britain. Reports could describe unrest without fully describing the pressure that caused it. Officials could describe resistance as disorder, while ignoring the older order that empire had disrupted. Poverty under empire was rarely only the absence of wealth. It was often the result of being pulled into systems designed around distant priorities. In some regions, people were pushed toward wage labour because access to land had changed. In others, taxes forced participation in cash economies on terms people did not choose. In still others, local industries faced competition from British manufactured goods, while colonial economies were reorganised around raw materials and imperial trade. These processes were complex and varied, and they did not affect every person in the same way. Some local elites gained influence through cooperation. Some merchants found new opportunities. Some workers used imperial networks to move, earn, learn, and organise. But the larger structure remained unequal because the central question was rarely what local societies would choose for themselves. It was what would make the colony useful, stable, and profitable within the imperial system. The deeper human beginning returns here as a measure of what was being distorted. Human communities grew by adapting to their own landscapes, building memory around seasons, food sources, tools, rituals, and shared obligations. Empire interrupted that memory when it treated land as revenue, forests as timber, people as labour, and culture as something to be classified from outside. Repression followed when people refused to accept this arrangement. Resistance took many forms: petitions, strikes, revolts, religious movements, legal challenges, songs, newspapers, secret meetings, armed struggle, and the quiet preservation of identity inside homes and communities. British authorities often answered resistance with surveillance, prisons, emergency laws, military force, or political delay. Yet repression never proved that empire was secure. It proved the opposite. A system that must continually discipline the people it claims to improve is revealing the weakness inside its own story. The British Empire was powerful, but it was never simply accepted. Everywhere, people interpreted it through their own losses, hopes, memories, and strategies for survival. Some resisted openly. Some adapted while waiting for a safer moment. Some used imperial education, law, and print culture to challenge empire in its own language. The real story is therefore not one of order spreading peacefully across the world. It is a story of order and injury moving together, of infrastructure beside extraction, of law beside inequality, of schools beside humiliation, and of power meeting the steady refusal of human beings to be reduced to subjects in someone else's design. The British Empire was never one story moving in one direction. It was a mixture of power, profit, fear, administration, violence, adaptation, resistance, and memory. To some people in Britain, empire could look like national achievement: ships crossing oceans, goods filling warehouses, maps painted with imperial colour, and speeches about law, order, and civilization. To many people who lived under imperial rule, the same system could feel like land taken, taxes demanded, languages judged, labour redirected, customs misunderstood, and political choices narrowed by a distant authority. Both experiences belong to the same historical structure, but they were not equal experiences. One side often had the power to describe the empire. The other had to live inside the consequences. This is why the real story must avoid a simple judgment that either praises everything or condemns without explanation. The empire did build institutions, move technologies, connect markets, and create new forms of communication. It also extracted wealth, enforced racial hierarchy, supported coercive labour systems, and answered resistance with law or force. These truths do not cancel each other. They sit together uneasily because empire itself was an uneasy form of human organization. The deeper beginning of humanity helps us see why this matters. Human beings first built communities to protect fragile life. People needed food, shelter, care, memory, and cooperation. Larger systems were supposed to help life become more secure. Yet when a system grows too unequal, it can use the language of security while making many lives less secure. British imperial rule often claimed to bring stability, but stability for the ruler could mean obedience from the ruled. It could mean roads that served extraction, schools that served administration, courts that served hierarchy, and police forces that protected imperial order before local dignity. At the same time, colonized people were never merely victims, without thought or action. They interpreted, negotiated, resisted, learned, preserved, and reshaped what empire brought. Some used English education to argue for rights. Some used print culture to build national movements. Some used courts, petitions, unions, religious networks, and political associations to challenge imperial authority. Others resisted through everyday survival, keeping language alive, protecting family memory, maintaining ritual, refusing humiliation when refusal was possible, and teaching children a history not written by the rulers. This makes the legacy of empire complicated, but not unclear. The complication does not excuse the inequality. It shows how deeply the system entered human life. A railway line might remain after independence, but so might a border drawn with little regard for older communities. A legal code might continue, but so might habits of bureaucracy shaped by colonial control. A language might become useful for global communication while also carrying memories of cultural pressure. Ports, schools, courts, armies, currencies, and administrative boundaries could all outlive the empire that shaped them. Some became tools for new nations, others became burdens, many became both at once. This is one of the reasons the British Empire still matters in world history. It did not vanish when flags changed. It left traces in migration, trade, law, education, racial attitudes, political institutions, economic inequality, and the way different societies remember the past. The human body remains at the center of that memory. Empire is often drawn as territory, but it was lived as work, hunger, opportunity, fear, ambition, discipline, travel, language, grief, and hope. A miner in South Africa, a clerk in Calcutta, a sailor in Liverpool, a farmer in Jamaica, a student in Lagos, a soldier from Punjab, and a merchant in London were not living the same empire, even when they were tied to the same system. The empire's greatest power was to connect unequal lives across distance. Its greatest moral problem was that it made those inequalities seem normal, useful, or inevitable. By the time Britain stood near the height of imperial reach, the story had become too large for any single national myth. It was not only a British story, it was also Indian, African, Caribbean, Irish, Indigenous, Australian, Middle Eastern, and global in many different ways. The empire was made by Britain, but it was lived by the world. And because it was lived by the world, its legacy could never belong to Britain alone. The weakening of Britain's empire did not begin with a single surrender, a single speech, or a single act of independence. It began as the cost of power grew heavier than the island could easily carry. For centuries, Britain had learned to turn distance into advantage through ships, finance, ports, industry, armies, administration, and imperial networks. But the same system that gave Britain reach also demanded constant maintenance. Sea lanes had to be protected, colonies had to be governed, rival powers had to be watched, armies had to be supplied, debts had to be paid, subjects had to be managed, persuaded, or forced. An empire can look strong on a map while becoming tired inside its own machinery. The First World War exposed that strain sharply. Britain entered the war as the centre of a vast empire, drawing soldiers, labour, food, money, and materials from across its territories. Men from India, Africa, the Caribbean, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of the imperial world served or supported the war in different ways. The empire became a reservoir of manpower and resources, but using that reservoir changed the moral balance of the system. People asked why they should fight for freedom, security, or civilization while remaining politically unequal inside the empire that called for their help. The deeper human beginning returns here with quiet force. Human groups first survived because obligation and protection were supposed to move together. If people gave labor, loyalty, or risked their bodies, they expected some form of belonging, respect, or return. Empire often demanded obligation without equal belonging. The war made that contradiction harder to hide. The human body carried the truth before policy admitted it. Soldiers endured mud, disease, fear, injury, homesickness, and death. Workers carried loads, dug, cooked, transported, and repaired. Families far from Europe lost sons to a conflict that was not always explained in terms that matched their own lives. Britain survived the First World War, but survival came with debt, grief, social strain, and a changed world. The old confidence of empire remained in public language, but underneath it the structure had been weakened. After the war, new ideas about national self-determination circulated more widely, even when they were applied unevenly. Colonized peoples listened carefully. Political movements in India, Ireland, Egypt, and other places drew strength from older grievances and newer language. Britain could still rule, but ruling required more justification than before. The Second World War deepened the pressure. Once again, Britain drew heavily on the empire for soldiers, supplies, money, bases, and labour. Once again, the language of defending freedom stood beside the reality of imperial inequality. The war also damaged Britain's economy, exhausted its population, increased dependence on the United States, and revealed that global power was shifting. Germany had been defeated, but Britain did not emerge with the same freedom of action it had known in the 19th century. The United States and the Soviet Union now stood as the dominant powers in a new world order. Britain still had influence, but influence was no longer the same as imperial command. The old human problem of scale appeared again. A household can grow beyond what it can feed. A village can claim more land than it can defend. A state can hold more responsibility than its economy, population, and legitimacy can sustain. Empire is not only possession, it is burden, connection, resistance, and cost. Britain's empire had become too expensive materially and too difficult morally. In India, mass politics had grown stronger, and the demand for independence could not be treated as a temporary disturbance. In many other territories, veterans, workers, students, intellectuals, farmers, religious leaders, and political organisers pressed for rights, representation, and self-rule. The empire's own schools, railways, armies, laws, and communication systems had helped create the conditions for wider political awakening. People who had been ruled learned the language of rights, nationhood, dignity, and history, then turned those words back toward the rulers. This was one of the great reversals of empire. The structures built to govern distance also carried resistance across distance. Britain's decline as an imperial power was therefore not merely the result of weakness at home. It came from strength growing elsewhere, organised anti-colonial movements, changing global opinion, economic pressure, wartime sacrifice, and the refusal of millions of people to remain inside a hierarchy they had not chosen. By the mid-20th century, Britain could still negotiate, delay, manage, and sometimes fight. But the older idea that a small island could indefinitely rule vast populations across the world had lost its foundation. The empire had reached a point where its own scale made it fragile. What once looked like global mastery now looked increasingly like a system too heavy to hold. Decolonization did not arrive as one gentle release of power. It came through pressure, negotiation, protest, law, violence, exhaustion, and the steady growth of political imagination among people who had lived under imperial rule. After the Second World War, Britain still held a wide empire, but the world around it had changed. The language of empire sounded older now. The language of self-determination, national dignity, citizenship, labour rights, and political equality had become harder to silence. Colonized peoples had fought in wars, worked in imperial economies, paid taxes, carried burdens, and watched promises of freedom spoken loudly in Europe while being delayed in their own lands. That contradiction became one of the forces that weakened empire from within. India was the largest and most important turning point. The movement for Indian independence had deep roots, many voices, and many strategies, from constitutional politics and mass protest to labour organising, religious debate, regional demands, and revolutionary action. Leaders such as Mohandas Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, B.R. Hamda, Ambedkar, and many others represented different visions of political future, social justice, community, and statehood. No single person or party can contain the full story. The pressure came from millions of people, from villages, cities, students, workers, lawyers, peasants, soldiers, journalists, and families who had learned that empire was not a permanent fact of nature. In 1947, British rule in India ended, but independence came with partition, displacement, fear, and large-scale violence between communities. This was one of the painful truths of the end of empire. Freedom could arrive together with wounds that would last for generations. The deeper human beginning is visible here, because human beings do not live only under flags. They live through homes, neighbours, food, memory, language, burial places, and the feeling of belonging somewhere. When borders are drawn and authority changes, the body feels history first, in walking, fleeing, waiting, grieving, rebuilding, and trying to protect children. Across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Middle East, decolonization followed different paths. Some transitions were negotiated with less direct violence. Others were marked by war, emergency rule, imprisonment, repression, or long resistance. Ghana's independence in 1957 became a major symbol for African self-rule. Other African states followed in waves, each with its own internal politics and colonial inheritance. In Malaya, Kenya, Cyprus, Palestine, Aden, and other places, the end of British power involved conflicts, security campaigns, and deep local struggle. In the Caribbean, independence often came through constitutional development, labour movements, political organising, and regional debates about federation and sovereignty. The pattern was not identical, but the larger movement was clear. People who had been governed from elsewhere increasingly insisted that political authority should answer to those who lived with its consequences. Britain did not always leave because it suddenly accepted the full moral argument against empire. It left because costs rose, resistance grew, global opinion shifted, economic realities changed, and the old structure no longer held. The United States often opposed old-style colonialism in principle while also pursuing its own strategic interests. The Soviet Union criticized imperial rule while competing for influence. The United Nations gave anti-colonial claims a wider stage. The post-war economy made direct rule harder to justify and harder to afford. Britain tried to manage the process, preserve influence, protect trade, maintain military bases, and shape new political arrangements where possible. Formal empire gave way to the Commonwealth, diplomatic relationships, economic ties, migration, and cultural connections. But the ending of direct rule did not mean the ending of imperial consequences. Borders remained, legal systems remained, languages remained, unequal economies remained. Memories of violence, education, service, humiliation, opportunity, and loss remained. New nations inherited not blank beginnings, but institutions, debts, divisions, railways, armies, civil services, and boundaries shaped by colonial history. Some leaders used these inheritances to build states. Others struggled against the burdens placed inside them. The old human problem returned in modern form. How can a community organize itself after long external control? And how can people make a shared future from a past that was not shared equally? Britain's empire ended not because history naturally moves toward justice, but because people forced change, because systems weakened, and because the moral foundation of rule from afar became harder to defend. The small island that had once turned outward through sea power now had to face a different world, one in which the people it had ruled were no longer willing to remain subjects of someone else's story. The real story of how Britain became a global empire does not end with a simple lesson about greatness or guilt. It ends with a quieter understanding. Power is never made from one source alone. Britain's rise came from geography. but geography did not decide everything. It came from ships, but ships needed forests, dockyards, sailors, money, food, discipline, and ports. It came from trade, but trade often depended on unequal law, protected routes, monopoly, and force. It came from industry, but industry needed coal, labour, raw materials, markets, and the ability to connect distant lands to machines at home. It came from institutions, but institutions could serve both order and domination. It came from human skill, and also from human suffering. To tell the story honestly, all of these must remain together. A small island on the edge of Europe learned to turn water into movement, movement into trade, trade into influence, influence into rule, and rule into a global system. But every step carried a cost. Some costs were paid in taxes and debt inside Britain. Some were paid by sailors, workers, soldiers, and poor families. Many were paid far away by enslaved people, colonized communities, indigenous peoples, farmers, laborers, and generations whose choices were narrowed by decisions made elsewhere. The deeper human beginning matters here because it reminds us that history is not made by maps alone. Before any empire, there were bodies needing rest, children needing care, communities needing land, and people trying to make life safer across time. Empire enlarged human organization, but it also revealed how organization can lose sight of the human being. When distance grows, responsibility can grow faint. A person in one place may enjoy comfort without seeing the field, mine, ship, prison, office, or battlefield that helped produce it. The British Empire became powerful because it mastered distance, but its moral wound also came from distance. It separated decision from consequence, profit from pain, and command from the people who had to live under command. The educational value of this story is not that one nation was uniquely evil, or uniquely gifted, or chosen by history. That would be too simple and too easy. The value is to see how power grows when environment, technology, finance, violence, belief, and opportunity align over time. It is to see how ordinary needs can become vast systems. The need for security can become naval policy. The need for goods can become colonial trade. The need for energy can become industrial extraction. The need for order can become administration over people who were never treated as equals. And the need for dignity can become resistance, independence, and the long effort to reclaim a future. Britain's empire eventually faded as a formal structure, but the world it shaped did not disappear. Languages, borders, migrations, legal systems, trade routes, memories, inequalities, and cultural exchanges remain. Some people remember empire through railways, schools, service, and law. Others remember it through famine, forced labour, racism, land loss, and humiliation. Many remember both, because human history rarely fits into one clean sentence. The most honest way to hold this past is not to turn away from its complexity, but to keep asking who benefited, who paid, who was heard, and who was made silent. In the end, Britain became a global empire because it learned how to organize distance better than many of its rivals. It turned an island's vulnerability into maritime attention into commercial reach into imperial control, and imperial control into a world-spanning system. But the final meaning of that story cannot belong only to Britain. It belongs to every shore touched by its ships, every community drawn into its markets, every family changed by its laws, and every nation that had to build a future after it. And perhaps the last question is not only how a small island became so powerful, but what happens to human memory when power travels farther than responsibility.